you for coming. The Mill series is delighted to welcome David Fuller to Lafayette College. David is a British journalist and filmmaker, having made films for the BBC, Channel 4, and other media outlets. He is also the founder of Rebel Wisdom, a media platform that seeks to move beyond reaction and ideology, and that believes in the rebellious, transformative power of genuine truth. Please join me in welcoming David to Lafayette.
I started working for Channel 4 News and the BBC, just over 10 years ago now, 2008. And Rebel Wisdom goes back about 18 months, something like that. Back in 2017, I went out to, I know Jordan Peterson has talked here a while ago, and I went out to Canada actually just to go watch one of his lectures and thought, well, I might as well get an interview with him while I'm out there. I'm a journalist, so I applied, got an interview.
You came in from where?
I came in from London. I ended up making the first documentary about him. I got the interview and then thought, well, no one's actually kind of done a documentary about his thoughts, so I put that together. And then just after I put that out, literally about 3 or 4 days after I put that out, he went on Channel 4 News and had that very famous viral interview with Cathy Newman that maybe some of you might have seen. And I used to work with Cathy Newman. So I was actually in the office in Channel 4 News probably about 2 weeks, maybe a month before that interview went out. So I was still freelancing there while I was doing documentaries. And so I was like, this is a really weird position to be in. I put out the first documentary about Jordan Peterson, and then he kind of rockets to fame on the news program that I used to work for. So I was like, what am I supposed to do with this? And the irony was, a lot of what I talked to him about was synchronicity, this kind of Jungian psychological idea of coincidences that have a deeper meaning. So I was like, this is kind of a weird synchronicity. What am I supposed to do? So for a while I started trying to negotiate behind the scenes between Cathy Newman and Jordan about maybe doing another interview. Because I don't know if you remember, after the interview there was a lot of controversy, and Jordan felt that Channel 4 was sort of spinning that Cathy was the victim, and there was a lot of stuff going on Twitter, and it was kind of like watching two people that I knew were good people and trying to sort of bring them back together to have a dialogue. And Jordan was really keen and Cathy wasn't. So I was like, okay, that's not going to work. So in the end, I put together this film called Glitch in the Matrix, looking at the Cathy Newman interview and why it had gone viral and what it said about the media, sort of the balance between the mainstream media and the alternative media, what it said about us as a culture. And it became, so Jordan put it onto his channel. It's now got about 2.5 million views on his channel. It's on our channel as well, where it's got about 500,000, I think. So that's sort of by far the most popular thing that we've put out there, and has become I think it's the third most popular thing on Jordan Peterson's channel now, which it's kind of been going up and up and up for a while most of his other stuff has stalled, which has been really, I've been sort of watching it for quite a while, just seeing how popular it's getting. So in that film, I put in a few criticisms of Channel 4 News and a few sort of criticisms of Cathy Newman, so I knew when I put that out that I was making it much more difficult, like to go back into the newsroom, and I kind of knew that I was kind of ending my career in the mainstream media by doing it, but I just had this sense that there was something more exciting kind of on the other side. And Rebel Wisdom pretty much started through that piece. But this is why the topic of the intellectual dark web is quite close to my heart, because I feel that there's some skin in the game then. Like I kind of put all of my chips on Jordan Peterson and the intellectual dark web. And so when that first Glitch in the Matrix film was out, or when I was putting that out, literally in the last week or so that I was working on it, I saw this thing called the intellectual dark web on the Dave Rubin show, and I thought, oh, that's a quite interesting concept, and I put a few lines in the film and then put it into the title. So literally about 2 weeks after the IDW was named.
Fortunately, thanks to YouTube, podcasting, and however else you get shows like this one, the mainstream media's stranglehold on information, which really is a stranglehold on your ability to think clearly about the issues of the day, is crumbling at an incredible rate. Now the question is, who and what will replace it? A few months ago, one of my favorite people to sit across this table from, Eric Weinstein, came up with the phrase intellectual dark web to describe this eclectic mix of people, from Sam Harris to Ben Shapiro to his brother Brett Weinstein to Jordan Peterson, all of whom are figuring out ways to have the important and often dangerous conversations that are completely ignored by the mainstream.
So that was the Dave Rubin clip about what is the IDW. And this next clip is a set of little pieces from Jordan Peterson, Heather Hying, and a few other people who've been in our films.
It's like a herd of cats, right? Because, so I've thought about, well, what unites us to the degree that there's an us, because that's not so self-evident. There's enough of an us so that the name emerged and it's stuck. So there's something in common, because otherwise the name wouldn't have stuck, right? You can't name nothing. It doesn't work.
So what is the intellectual dark web?
People in the group tend to reject orthodoxy, tend to reject ideology, tend to be interested in first principles thinking, meaning that if you don't take something on faith.
It's a very smart concept to try to corral a very difficult group of very disparate people into one orbit. I think everybody who's been described as a member of the IDW probably has, among other things, one thing in common, which is they all are used to being howled at for saying things that are self-evident, howled at in public, only to then discover that the public come up to them in private and say, thank you so much for saying what we think.
I would say it is actually the manifestation of the process of thinking that's more important than the conclusions that are generated.
You need a group of people who are willing to say, hey, you made a better point, I've changed my mind, and I've learned something that I didn't think about. And that kind of integrity in a conversation is what characterizes a lot of the internal IDW discussion to me. It's that people agree not on their positions, they may not even agree as to what the facts are, but they usually agree as to what constitutes a conversation.
So yeah, the IDW was kind of a coming to consciousness of a conversation that had been growing organically online for quite a while. And then when it sort of surfaced, it caught on because a lot of people recognized it as a kind of emergent phenomenon. And one of the people on our channel, Daniel Thorson, talked about Peterson in particular, Jordan Peterson in particular, breaking a conversational seal, which I thought was a really beautiful way of looking at it. In this talk, I'd like to talk about kind of what the initial idea of the IDW was, and whether it's kind of lived up to its promise, lived up to its ideals, and lived up to the kind of initial pitch. And I think it both has and hasn't. It's certainly very, very successful. I mean, I'm part of about 4 or 5 different Facebook groups set off the back of the IDW, and it certainly worked as a meme. Like, it took off. I think Jordan Peterson's framing of the name stuck, and it certainly refers to something. And that sort of question of what it refers to, I think, is really at the center of this kind of point, because it's often seen, is it a meme? Is it a particular group of people? Is it a way of conversing? There's all of these different ideas, and I think all of them have some truth. And I'd like to kind of go through some of those different ways of looking at it, and also talk about what I think it represents. And I think one of those is this sort of alternative media ecosystem. It was kind of the coming to consciousness of an alternative media ecosystem. I'm just going to read out the names of the people who were in the original New York Times article. The kind of official coming out of the IDW was this New York Times article that came out in over a year ago. So Barry Weiss is an opinion writer with the New York Times, and she wrote this piece that was kind of the lightning rod. It had already existed, so Sam Harris had talked about it, I think. Eric Weinstein had talked about it, Dave Rubin had talked about it, and this was the New York Times kind of giving it its blessing a little bit. And so the official kind of start in terms of mainstream media was about this time. There was a paradox of it kind of shifting, because as soon as it was acknowledged by the mainstream media, it was no longer dark. And so there's a kind of paradox, and it was criticized at the beginning, because people were saying, how can you say that Joe Rogan, who's probably the most powerful broadcaster around, is in this dark web? This is ridiculous. So, and that's kind of true. A lot of the people in there are some of the most popular and most successful podcasters and media personalities, like Douglas Murray in the UK is the editor of The Spectator, or the associate editor of The Spectator, the oldest magazine. So there's a kind of paradox. I'll read out the names of all of the people who were in that first New York Times article. So Sam Harris, Eric Weinstein, Dave Rubin, Brett Weinstein, Heather Hying, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Douglas Murray, Majid Nawaz, Ayin Hirsi Ali, Christina Hoff Sommers, Joe Rogan, Claire Lehman, and Deborah So. This is interesting because Eric Weinstein was the key. So there were pictures of about, I don't know, maybe 10 altogether of the people who were in there, and these all very sort of heavily stylized pictures. Like there's sort of there was a deliberate sort of I don't know, what would you say, almost a mystique around it from the beginning. And it's interesting as well that Eric is the first person featured, because Eric is nowhere near as well known as, say, Dave Rubin or Joe Rogan, but that's quite significant, I think. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know this for sure, but I'm almost certain that Eric had a lot of contact with Barry Weiss before this got put together and was sort of heavily involved in the creation of the article, which is worth kind of bearing in mind for later on. And there was a few sort of central thoughts that the IDW is centered around, as we heard already in some of those clips, the idea that there are certain things that can and can't be said in the mainstream media, that long-form content allows for the exploration of ideas that the mainstream media is now sort of putting into like 30-second sound bites if you're lucky, and that just encourages polarization, it encourages oppositional thinking, and maybe we can start to kind of have much more nuanced discussions. But also it's formed around the idea that there are certain ideas that are so nuanced and so difficult to discuss. Take sort of gender as an example, and that's obviously the Kathy Newman, Jordan Peterson discussion, that if you force it into a kind of mainstream media perspective, you can't do it. It needs longer to explain and a nuanced perspective to be held. And also, but there's a much deeper story to the IDW as well that I think we explored quite well in the second film. So we did Glitch in the Matrix 1 and then we did Glitch in the Matrix 2. That was, who's seen that? Has anyone seen that? You're nodding. Have you seen it? No, you've seen it. So Glitch in the Matrix 2 was really Eric Weinstein talking about why he thought the IDW was necessary, where it came from, and he has a story that goes back to the 1980s. And I believe him. I believe his story. I think he's onto something. So Eric Weinstein is a mathematician, physicist, and gave a talk to Oxford in, I think, 2009, where he's got a theory called geometric unity that he thinks could be a theory of everything. So this is the kind of level that he kind of is looking at the world and thinking about the world on. And his theory is that looking at the institutions since the 1980s, what we've done in the West is created institutions that have kept out heterodox thinkers, where like the fresh ideas usually come from the marginal figures, the difficult figures, the ones who won't go along with the consensus, and that we've created structures that basically push those people out. And that's what, for him, the IDW is. It's sort of within the media, it's all the people who've been pushed out and all the perspectives that have been pushed out of the media. But his theory about the IDW goes all the way down to, that's why we haven't had any advances in physics. That's why biology is stuck. This is something that Brett talks about. Like, biology has been stuck since the 1960s. Eric says, like, string theory is a completely wrong turn. It's unverifiable. All of these different areas have become stuck at the same time because of this sort of central idea that we've pushed out all the heterodox thinkers. And we've done it because we don't understand that these difficult characters, of which Eric is definitely one, and a lot of his story, a lot of the story in Glitch in the Matrix 2 is based around his experience as well. Why he felt that his ideas weren't being respected, weren't being taken in, and why all of these institutions have got stuck at the same time. It's kind of that the IDW is this sort of the public face of a conversation that needs to happen within lots of these institutions that have been captured by groupthink, captured by consensus. So that's another sort of deeper layer to it. Because sometimes on the films that we put out, we get comments on YouTube saying this was just a one-off conversation. Eric was just throwing something out. You're reading too much into this. It's like, well, maybe, but Eric's possibly reading too much into it as well. And I'm also convinced that, again, I don't know this. I've obviously spoken a fair bit to some of these people behind the scenes, but I don't know this from those conversations. I'm pretty sure that Eric's a very persuasive guy, and I'm pretty sure that he's persuaded a lot of the other members of the IDW that this is what's the overall perspective is. And so it's kind of an existential threat from that perspective. Like there is a kind of, there's a very powerful narrative underneath a lot of this. So this talk is really that the central question for me is whether the IDW is still creating novelty, is still creating newness, because I sense that it was at the beginning of, when I first became aware of it, mostly on the Rubin report, you had conversations between between Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson that seemed to be going into new territory. You had conversations between Brett and Eric that seemed to be going into new territory, and there's a sort of aliveness to the conversations that I've not seen so much of recently, and I wonder why that is. I've got a few ideas. I also want to say that what I'm saying now, I'd love this to start a conversation. I know that we're kind of doing this for YouTube as well. These are my ideas, and this isn't the final word on it. I'm sort of putting out some ideas, but this is just sort of starting a conversation about why this might be the case, if it's true that it's not creating as much novelty as it did. So, again, sort of coming back to what is the IDW? Is it this group of people, or is it a way of interacting? One of my favorite perspectives is from a guy called Ryan Bennett, who was central to the IDW meetup in New York after a conference there failed to happen. He sort of took, so he's quite connected with a lot of the people in the IDW, and I really like this. So his concept is he's a computer programmer, and he says trying to make sense of the IDW by looking at who's in it is like trying to make sense of the internet by looking at what's on your hard drives. So try and see it as a kind of network protocol. So a network, how do you understand the internet? Well, you understand how the computers are talking to each other, what the IP protocols are. That tells you a lot more about what the internet is than the contents of what's on it. And I like this as a concept. When you pursue truth instead of power, you're in the IDW, and you favour understanding over judgment, value ideas more than identity, you're in the IDW. Again, I think it's really worth thinking about these as ideals and asking kind of how much the conversations in the IDW have lived up to these ideals. I'd like to play the clip number 5. This is Brett and Eric on the Rubin report. This for me is one of the most compelling framings of what the conversation of the IDW should talk about and the territory it should cover.
And once we give up on the idea that anybody on the map today has the answer with respect to the policies that we are supposed to embrace, once we say actually everybody's policies are a failure, if we were to enact the libertarian program, it would fail for game theoretic reasons. If we were to enact the socialist program, it would fail for game theoretic reasons.
Same thing.
Right. So the point is, okay, fresh sheet of paper with respect to policy. Now there's a lot for us to talk about, starting from values.
You can say, we don't actually have the answer. We don't know. And it's very important that the people who are certain be silent, because they are not the important people at this moment.
Yeah, I find that quite a compelling framing, and just sort of saying that we need a new form of conversation with a new set of starting points. I want to go back to who is in the IDW, because there's a lot of people who are being framed as being part of it, and I think a good place to start is with Steven Pinker. Does everyone know who Steven Pinker is? So I'll just recap very quickly. Is he at Harvard?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's
at MIT and trained for
Yeah, and what's his official...
Professor of linguistics.
Professor of linguistics.
In psychology and linguistics, perhaps? Yeah, psychology. Okay,
Yeah? Cool. So Steven Pinker famously is famous big-haired academic who keeps writing the same book about how the world's getting better and better and better and how everything is wonderful and we just should be grateful for the miraculous times that we live in. And he's also spoken out about some of the same topics that members of the IDW talk about, kind of the ideological capture of the universities and some of those big topics. And he's often linked in with the IDW. And I think it's a really interesting, it's very illustrative about what the IDW is to say why I don't think he is. And I think that most of the IDW core would probably not think that he was as well, at least from the way that they explain the IDW. And that's because, and this is a real tension within the sort of core of the IDW as well, because, and I see it most cleanly in sort of Jordan Peterson, but are we living in the best of times, or are we living in a world that is kind of degrading fast and we're in an existential crisis? And I hear Jordan Peterson sometimes speak to one side of that and sometimes speak to the other. But Steven Pinker is clearly on that side of things. Eric and Brett and I'd say Sam Harris as well, and maybe some of the other members of the IDW are very much on the other side. And if you watch Glitch in the Matrix 2, the film with Eric, he frames it very much as a kind of existential crisis, and we need to create spaces where we can speak freely because of this existential crisis. So I think that for me takes the IDW as it was originally conceived out of the realm of just kind of anti, pro-free speech movement. It's more than that as it's originally kind of conceived. And so now I'm going to move on to kind of given the pitch for what the IDW is meant to achieve, and now I'd like to talk a little bit about what some of the criticisms are and what I consider valid criticisms of the IDW. And the first, I'd love to play that clip from, and this was very prophetic in a way, because this is, again, Eric and Brett talking on the Rubin report. And I'm going to come back to Dave Rubin quite a bit later on, because he's such a central figure in the IDW, kind of framed very much as the home of the IDW and also host of many of the original conversations. And I think he's so identified with it that the flaws in his, the way he conducts himself are now kind of reflecting on a lot the IDW in general. But this, I think, is one of the really key points of the dangers of this kind of movement.
Maybe there's a missing piece here, which is our economic system, when you plug it into certain things very directly, like journalism, I think actually this is your point originally, that it's truth-seeking, which cannot withstand direct contact with market forces. That when you do that, you generate artificially feeble truth-seeking mechanisms, and it eventually invades them all. So how hard is it to beat the mainstream news outlets? Not very hard, because they're so bad at delivering.
Not very hard at analysis. It's very hard to beat them at some kind of
competition.
Right.
Competitively, they're extremely dominant. But in terms of what they're trying to deliver, they're terrible. Likewise, the university system.
Yeah. Because I think initially the way that the IDW was framed was that because they're not part of a corporate structure, because they have their own podcasts, they have independent audience and their independent means, they can avoid that sort of capture by market forces and corporate forces. But that's just not the case. I mean, I know from running a YouTube channel, you're constantly aware of what the commenters are saying on your channel, and you get to you feel that as a kind of gravitational force. You know what they like, you know what they don't like. You've started monetizing it, so you know what the paying fans want and what they don't. And so it's absolutely the case that if you're starting up a podcast or if you're starting up your own media channel, you're not immune from those forces at all. And you're not immune from... so market forces, you can kind of look at kind of financial forces, but you can also look at it like sex, power, and all those other social dynamics are also market forces. What you're doing for kind of for reputation, and that starts to kind of interfere with searching for truth as well. just the fact that there is a comment thread and knowing what the audience like and what they don't like. You can, I mean, you'd have to not be human to not feel that in some way.
Yeah, I feel it too, and I think we should be honest about that and be able to laugh at it a little bit. And I think to sort of zoom out a little bit of, you know, you and I have talked a lot before, and I keep coming back to this line of the dangers that lurk in something like the IDW conversation, or even followers and fans of it, is, you know, once this mistake that I've come to notice or basically profess is that there seems to be a trend of people who think the moment that they have rejected bad philosophy or a bad philosophy, it also means they've rejected bad psychology, and they really have nothing to do with each other. It doesn't mean you're not susceptible to the lures of status and sex and money and all of these other things. And even if someone rejects a political leaning, being like, oh, I've noticed that the left is really wacky and has gone overboard, and look, like I woke to this in sort of the red pill way, or either side of that. If whatever your political epiphany is, that doesn't mean you've escaped the normal trappings that we all deal with of weak psychology, and they relate, but they don't correlate the way that I think a lot of people tend to jump the gun and think they have, and that goes for the personalities in the IDW, that goes for the big names that we all know who are on stage, that goes for people like you and I who are trying to sort of tell the story of these people, it goes for people following it. I think we all have to just sort of be honest about that. Again, laugh about it a little bit. If there's anything that binds us as humans together, that would be a great thing to sort of, you know, find common ground, even with your political enemy, is like, we're all susceptible to these kind of things. We should admit that. And then what you do with it is really important.
Also, once you identify yourself as they did with the IDW being a thing, you start to create aligned incentives. Like, they're talking, speaking tours together, or book deals, or all of that sort of stuff. That starts to come in. And then especially on something like Twitter, where you're kind of like, is innately tribalizing, you're then sticking up for each other and those kind of factors. So you start to create a tribe around an anti-tribal ideology. It sort of becomes a little bit paradoxical. And I think that paradox has been playing out quite a bit. And to talk a little bit about one of the things that I think the IDW at its best, or the members of the IDW at their best do, is create a sort of high-resolution critique of culture, like cultural movements. Gender was a perfect example that I talked about before. Like, those conversations have to be had with real nuance and real delicacy. And they're very easily, as soon as they come down to a lower level, a low resolution perspective, then I think it's almost like a lie. The high resolution perspective is very illuminating. The low resolution one is just a cliche. And I think at their best, some of the people in the IDW do hold that high resolution critique. But at their worst, I think they do slip to a low resolution critique. Like, Jordan Peterson at his best is very high resolution. At his worst, it comes down to very sort of, it can be quite simplistic, kind of reacting against the excesses of the left, and it just becomes quite kind of cliched. Dave Rubin, who's highly identified with the IDW, like his whole thing is like how the left has gone insane, and that's pretty much the whole frame that he puts everything through. And I think that's not searching after truth. I mean, if you're going to search after truth, I think you need to have a more high-resolution critique than that. Also, this sense of tribalism, kind of going against tribalism, has it created a new tribalism? I think we've got the piece here that Kathy Young wrote for Quillette, where she looked at what is the unifying factor behind the people who are seen as being part of the IDW. And it's often been called reactionary. And I know that people in the IDW wouldn't like that phrase, but I think there is some truth in it. I think they are reacting to something. And the question is whether it's something that needs to be reacted to, like how widespread is the ideological capture of institutions now, and how dangerous is that? And the biggest criticism of the IDW, I think, and Kathy points to that in this piece, is that they are becoming tribalist themselves. Just there are these huge forces that pull you towards tribalization, especially on social media and particularly on Twitter, where most of this conflict is happening. So a lot of the commentary on the IDW is kind of asking, okay, what is the thing that unites the people within it? And I mean, obviously part of that is going to be sort of a resistance to extreme kind of ideological thinking on the left, what you might call kind of woke culture. And there's a question of what that actually means and whether that is the new dividing line in culture. Uri Harris had a few articles in Quillette around that. Ezra Klein wrote something in Vox that I know a lot of the people in the IDW didn't like it, but I thought with some, there were some issues with it, but I think he actually did a pretty good job of kind of sketching out the new landscape, like what are the new dividing lines, because that's like what is underneath this. And Eric Weinstein has kind of agreed with that, and he says that the main dividing line is this upgrade to the left.
If you break progressivism or the left or whatever you want to call it into the traditional liberal core of the left, and then you augment that with a fairly recent, extremely aggressive upgrade, which appears to be willing to attack reason, civility as agents of oppression, or tools of oppression. I think that upgrade is really what is at issue and a question, what is being questioned. And if you believe that upgrade, that extremely postmodern adjustment to classically progressive positions, if you think that is now the new dominant left and it's not going away, you probably take a fairly dismissive attitude towards the entire left of center canon of thought. And I would say that there are members of the IDW who believe that this current aggressive strain has displaced classically liberal or classically progressive positions, which will never return, and that we now need to deal with the fact that that upgrade is permanent. And those people have probably decided that they are going to abandon any hope in a left of center position. Well, if I held that position, that upgrade, if you will, that marginal difference in a level of aggression and a willingness to attack reason and data and evidence and itself in favor of tying people in knots logically and epistemologically, if I thought that was permanent, I would understand exactly why these people were completely abandoning any kind of high-resolution view of the left. Now, it happens that I understand why they're saying that, but I disagree. I believe that many people are fairly moderate and liberal in their views and are going through a period akin to the McCarthy era, which I've called left-Carthyism, in which it's very dangerous to simply say the obvious, which is when you're attacking reason or one of two genders or concepts as abstract as patriarchy or anything like that, you probably made a fairly significant wrong turn somewhere in your thinking.
So this is another frame that I find particularly useful to understand kind of the culture war dynamic at the moment. A friend of mine, Peter Limberg, wrote this piece, a white paper, about Culture War 2.0, saying that if Culture War 1.0 was about left versus right, what we actually have now is a kind of fragmentation of the culture war where we have maybe, I don't know exactly how many, maybe 12 different what he called mimetic tribes fighting each other. And he did a spreadsheet with all of their mimetic tribes, like what they believe and how a lot of the real fighting that we're seeing at the moment is kind of in the left, like between different tribes on the left or between different tribes on the right. And really worth checking this one out. Maybe we can send you some of the links after the talk. And in this, he also talked about the value of what he called mimetic mediation, which is like, how do you mediate between the different warring tribes? And I think that's a really, really valuable concept that I'd like to see kind of being spread a bit more, because that's another criticism of the IDW that I think is worth making, is I don't see them reaching out so much to people in other tribes and looking at kind of negotiating between them. I don't see much strategy in having people from different tribes onto their shows, for example, and dialoguing with them. I see them mostly commenting and talking to people within their particular tribe. And then there's often kind of defenses where people talk about bad faith. You can't talk to that person, they're a bad faith actor. I'd suggest that mimetic mediation is something that finding someone who is in one of the tribes but is able to dialogue. So I think people right in the center of those tribes are probably unreachable, but there's always people on the outside who are open to dialogue and open to communication. And I don't see that happening so often. The other criticism of the IDW, I would say, is the need to embrace criticism. And there's a dialogue between Eric Weinstein and Sam Harris saying that they're both getting worse. They feel that they're getting worse because most of the criticism that they've had so far has been really low quality, and that they need better quality criticism. Yeah, and the other point is that the IDW was very specifically framed as an environment, a group of people who would come together, discuss things and potentially change minds. And I genuinely can't think of a single example where someone in the IDW has changed their mind over anything significant over the last 18 months or so since the IDW came along. And if the IDW is a project that is able to kind of carve out a beachhead and then potentially create a space in culture for people to have conversations and change their minds, if they're not even doing that within the IDW itself, how on earth are they going to do that or model that for everyone else?
To Eric's point, probably about what you want in any system, you want a method of error detection and correction. David Deutsch is my favorite thinker. I think I tweet about him more than anyone else. I'm a huge fan of David Deutsch's work, and he sort of pins that sentence as if there's a commandment of the universe that you could try to derive from the universe itself, and the famous is-ought distinction, it would be something like that sustaining and building the systems to detect and correct errors. Of course, you have to decide what an error is, and that's a different philosophical question, is the most important thing. And for that, Eric's right. For thinkers, what you want is an incubator that can detect and correct errors. And if it becomes tribal and it has biases that start building within it, that there's certain errors that just are never detected. Maybe I'm pointing to some of the errors of pretending that we're animals that suddenly don't want sex because we're sitting in an IDW room or something like that. You want an ability to detect and correct errors, and open discussion and a culture of criticism is important to uphold. So in that respect, tribal thinking, if it becomes unable to correct itself, is I would say an objective wrong and an objective evil in the universe, to sort of borrow some more Deutschian language.
And central to that, I think, is Dave Rubin, because Dave Rubin has been centre. Does everyone here know who Dave Rubin is? Rubin Report. So I've got a little clip. A little clip of the interview that I did with Dave in the summer, I think.
Yeah, well, I guess if there's a physical center of the intellectual dark web, it's right here. I mean, it's in my garage, because I think this is not where the ideas all started, but at least where most of the connections between the people started. And, people ask me my role in this whole thing and whether it is a thing at all, whether it is some sort of card-carrying organization or it's this loose affiliation or whatever it is. I think my role in it is I've been a little bit of the connective tissue between the people.
And the criticism that I've seen is that you don't push back hard enough against people when they maybe deserve it, that you give an easy ride to people.
Listen, I would say I'm interviewing people the way I like to interview them. I like to sit across from somebody, look them in the eye, and figure out what their ideas are. The bigger you get, the more relevant you get, the more haters are going to come out, but the more that legitimate criticism will come out too. And again, I address this all the time.
What do you think is the most legitimate criticism?
It's not really for me to say what the legitimate criticism of me. If someone wants to say that they don't like the way I interview or that I don't ask hard enough questions or something like that, well, I suppose that is a legitimate criticism of me. It's not the way I like doing my business. And, if you don't like what I'm doing, then I would say you don't have to watch.
I wanted to interview him, and I've been wanting to interview him for a while after seeing those first Rubin Report shows. But when I started researching in the run-up to it, and I was just looking at some of his old programs, I was thinking there's something a little bit off here. And it's not just... So Rubin famously interviews controversial figures, and that's fine. I think that's a valuable thing to do, but only if you're giving the audience the necessary information to make up their own minds about who these people are. Ask them, push them about certain things that they've said. So in the research for it, and then subsequently, there's an amazing series of films by a guy called Timber on Toast called Dave Rubin's Battle of Ideas, which is a fantastic watch. It's literally 4 hours of forensic analysis of what the Rubin Report does and how it does it that is really an amazing piece of work.
A running theme which I want to be constantly shining a spotlight on throughout this whole thing is exploring how well the Rubin Report does in achieving its main goal of fostering open and honest conversations about ideas.
Yeah, Timber, it's really good to catch up. I really enjoyed your films, and it looked like you put an awful lot of work into making them. Why did you go to so much work, like 4 hours, just based on the Rubin Report?
The main reason was I could see that there was a lot of criticism emerging online, but that people would rarely provide substantive examples of the things that they were accusing Dave of. And I think when you've got that criticism without examples or without like justification, it does come across as quite sort of malicious, and it doesn't seem like it's like good faith. So my main motivation in making the videos was, so I knew the examples because I followed Dave for a long time, like from the beginning of his show, like 2015. I'd been there for all the kind of example interviews as they'd come up, the ones that I sort of pointed out. And I thought if I assemble these in a tight structure that people can easily follow, people who have watched him and people who have never watched him, then at least when these criticisms come up, people can look into them and know what they're based on. If after watching my videos, they have no problem still with the interview style or the way he conducts things, that's fine. But at least then they know what it's based on.
So how would you summarize those criticisms?
So I'd say firstly that he never pushes back on guests. Therefore, whenever there is an idea presented that needs to be investigated into like its strengths and weaknesses, the audience aren't given a chance to explore that because they don't see the counter argument or the challenge. And the other criticism would be that he sanitizes unsavory characters, not by platforming them, which I think is the straw man kind of argument of what it is. I think he sanitizes them by presenting them as something they are not. Whenever there's a chance to get to the bottom of some sort of controversial thing they've said in the past, he skirts around it or does something to obfuscate it. I think those are the two main criticisms.
You almost have to go to that level to really sort of to see what's being done. But generally, he'll have Stefan Molyneux on, or Tommy Robinson, who's a famous kind of sort of street fighting politician from the UK. Katie Hopkins is a provocateur, journalist. This guy Tommy Sotomayor, who is sort of famous for being quite anti-Semitic. And he doesn't ask them those kind of questions, doesn't put their words to them.
If Dave's interviews expose that people at the forefront of his struggle against the authoritarian left were xenophobic or misogynistic or white supremacists or rape apologists, it would deprecate the viewer's perception of the show's value and their connection to its emotional core. Dave therefore has to carefully sidestep around his guests, asking softball questions, helping them to deliver blows against their opponents, and flattering them at every step of the journey to ensure that they are shown in the best possible light. The dishonest framing of guests which we see in episodes of the Rubin Report isn't a glitch. It's a feature, a key selling point. Discussing controversial topics is all well and good, but it's worth very little if you don't combine it with debate and challenging questions to put the guests on the spot and get to the root of their ideologies. That would take actual courage, intellectual curiosity, and rigor, and it's definitely not an easy thing to do. You know, it might mean that your guests refuse to do your show again. It might mean that they stop inviting you along to do talks alongside them on stage, and it might mean that all those invitations you're getting to speak for right-wing groups conveniently dry up. But maybe that's what would need to happen in order for you to deliver the honest, worthwhile exchange of ideas, which you keep telling us that your show is all about.
As a journalist, I felt I had to push him on that and had to ask him those questions. And what I've seen since is that he refuses to engage with people who criticize him or ask questions about the show. I've seen him do that a lot on Twitter. And he claims that left-wingers don't want to go on the show. He has all of these right-wingers on the show because they want to come on and the left-wingers don't want to come on.
Hey Dave, so I've been watching your program since about like early time in high school. Now I'm in college, so it's been a while, but one thing that I really liked, something that you talked about here was the difference between diversity of thought and diversity of identity. Sure. Now the thing with a diversity of thought is I feel like that's a problem you actually perpetuate on your show, because the only time you really have left-wing guests are when they're members of the intellectual dark web, such as Harris or Weinstein, and they're only there for the bulk of the time to talk about the regressive left. And so I pretty much wanted to ask you, why won't you have Sam Cedar on?
Yeah, he's recording it too. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the guy's he's just a dishonest player who's just lied about me repeatedly. Like, I'm not going to do it.
So would you be willing to have Natalie Wynn of ContraPoints or David Pakman or Kyle Kalinske? All of these are progressives who have...
I'm not, in principle, I'm not against having any of them, but I'm not going to have people that attack me personally. I think it's pretty obvious if you watch what I did up here. Like, I don't attack people personally. I'm happy to talk about ideas. You're going to go after me personally, you're going to lie about me and slander me and things like that. Like, it's just not the game I'm playing. There's no winning it for me. You know, I have a certain set of rules when it comes to talking to people and how I sort of behave as a public person.
And there's a load of people like David Pakman, ContraPoints, Kyle Kalinske, who've asked to go on the show and he won't bring them on. And I now have heard from quite a few people, so he wasn't very happy with the interview that I did, had very little contact with him afterwards, and then it kind of shut down completely. And I've heard now that that has happened to a lot of other people who've tried to raise any concerns with him. And I think it's worth highlighting this because I think it illustrates quite a lot about the dangers of the IDW, this sort of slipping down to a tribal perspective. And also, I genuinely think that he's obviously not the only person that does this, but I think he's probably the most high-profile person who does. What I see him doing on Twitter is framing anyone who criticizes him as being motivated by bad faith or kind of a bad person.
Basically, Quillette, which is run by Clara Lehman, who's a former guest of mine, who has been very friendly and nice to me on my show and in all of our private exchanges, has done about 4 hit pieces on me recently, where they're really trying to single me out of the IDW crew, that I'm somehow the worst because I sit down and talk to some people that they don't like, and I talk to these people on the right and I don't question them exactly as they want, and all of these things. And they keep just writing piece after piece. Now, I got a shit ton of haters these days, which really is just the sign that I'm doing something good. I mean, it really is. And then the good liberals are just freaking out right now. And that's also why they're coming down on me, because I've left and I've survived. And you got to extract a pretty heavy price on a guy like that. Because if you look at my resume, if this is a back of a baseball card, and you look at my numbers, you'd be like, no, this guy has to be with them.
Yeah.
But I'm not.
But you're
and
not.
Because of that, they're like, well, we can't just let him walk. We got to break his knees.
You need to go and support him and be part of what he's doing, because he's under the gun now. Okay? Understand this. He's being attacked by some of the most vitriolic and dangerous people on earth. And if you guys do not support him now, then you're part of the problem. It's akin to you guys sitting on the side and watching your neighbors be slaughtered because they haven't come to your house yet.
And this is the last message that I probably have for where I think the IDW can go wrong and what I think it needs to do is just to actually embrace criticism. Embrace criticism, have the critics on the shows, maybe have some even kind of heated discussions if needed. And what I see them doing far too often is only talking to the people who already agree with them about most of the central stuff. And I'm gonna slip in a slight curveball here, and I don't know how this is gonna land. This is Ken Wilber, who Brandon has been getting into quite a bit recently. Okay, so Ken Wilber is a philosopher. He created something called integral theory in about the 90s. So it had a real high point in the 90s and early 2000s. Al Gore was a real fan of integral theory. So there's a kind of sliding doors moment with the Florida election was if Al Gore had become president, we might be living in a very different world now if it wasn't George Bush. But Ken Wilber has this theory about how consciousness evolves that I think is really, really useful as a frame to see where the IDW sometimes slips into a very simplistic narrative and when it sometimes goes beyond that. So this is a little graphic that I made to go at the beginning of a film that I did with Ken Wilber, and I think it's useful.
Jordan Peterson has become a global celebrity by weaving together mythology, science, philosophy and religion into a compelling theory of everything. One of the most influential philosophers of the last decades did something similar. Ken Wilber is the creator of integral theory, another attempt to pull together much of the world's knowledge and spiritual traditions into a theory of everything. Integral theory gained a big following in the 90s and 2000s and remains influential. After serious health problems over the last decade, Ken Wilber is now returning to the conversation. What do these two hugely influential thinkers have in common? Where do they disagree? And what can they learn from each other?
A lot of times when it comes to Jordan Peterson, it's not that I'll disagree with much of what he says. I agree with much of what he says. It's some of the things that he leaves out. I find this a little bit interesting because he's clearly an integral thinker.
To get the most out of this film, we'll need to introduce a little integral terminology. At the core of integral theory is the idea that cultures and societies go through specific levels of development in the same way as individuals do, becoming more sophisticated as they develop or grow up. It's an idea that's common to developmental theorists, including Peterson's favourite, Jean Piaget.
You move from one knowledge structure to the next one, which includes the previous one and is better. And it's better because it covers more territory. That's how you know it's better. It does the same thing the old tool does, plus some additional things. So it's a definition of better.
Integral theory represents this development as a spiral. In this film, we'll mostly be talking about amber, tribalism, ethnocentric, authoritarian, which first emerged about 5,000 years ago. Orange, modern values, the rational self, that emerged 300 years ago with the liberal democracies and the beginning of universal values. Green, the values of relativism, multiple perspectives, dialogue and consensus, human rights, sometimes called postmodern, which emerged fully in the 1960s. If they're healthily integrated, they support each other. But each of them can believe that their way of looking at the world is the only true way, and then they are mutually exclusive. For Wilber, the incomprehension between these worldviews is what's causing many of the worst excesses of the culture wars. Above these levels, Wilber says, is another level called integral, or second tier. From this perspective, it's clear that each of the previous ways of seeing the world has value and needs to be integrated.
So I don't know if this is really confusing or helpful, but basically the idea is, so Ken Wilber's map, and I've met a few people who talk about this as an integral OS, like an integral operating system, is very, very helpful to understand, especially with what happened when, so green postmodern was civil rights, feminism, the idea that before then you had orange values, which was basically there's one way of looking at the world, it's based on science, it's based on kind of, it's based on a sort of single perspective, and then what we had coming in the 60s and developing after it was the idea that there are multiple perspectives that are not being included. And that's an advance. That realization is actually an advance on the previous one, because there are perspectives that are not included, there are voices that are not being heard. Bringing those in is really essential. But what can happen and what's been happening over the last 10, 15 years by Wilber's perspective is that if you forget that, or what you can end up with is just a cacophony of voices. Like you lose the idea of truth altogether. Like all truth is relative, so you've just lost the idea of any kind of central truth. You've lost all truths just become perspectives. And then what you end up in is kind of narcissism and nihilism. And if that's where we are, and I think that there's some truth to that, the theory is that these levels of development, they emerge and then they become pathological just before we move on to a new level of development. So I think from this perspective, what the IDW is generally doing is pointing out most of the flaws with Green, with postmodern, with saying there is a truth, it's not just about perspective, and the danger is that I think at its worst, the people in the IDW don't see that that is actually a positive value, that it is valuable to see different perspectives. And the idea with integral, the teal one at the top, is that its second tier is considered an evolution of consciousness, where you can actually start to see that all of these different levels before have some value. And that's where I think, at its best, the thinkers on the intellectual dark web, and I'd include someone like Jonathan Haidt here as well, he's very good at seeing that most of our political beliefs are temperamental. So thinking that someone's kind of worse or better based on their political beliefs is like you're judging someone for the way that they're wired rather than just for what they think. So there's an ebook that Ken Wilber wrote around this called Trump and a Post-Truth World that I would really highly recommend if anyone's interested to know more about this frame. And my sort of final thought is that Eric in Glitch in the Matrix 2, and in his sort of framing of the idea of the IDW, was saying that it's needed because of the corrupting effect of groupthink and aligned incentives within institutions, and the kind of paradox is that by creating the IDW, I think they've actually made themselves subject to some of those same forces. And that's a kind of paradox of, in the naming and creation of it, it sort of has allowed it to be captured by some of those same forces. So thank you very much for listening. We're going to have a few questions and a Q&A now.
So you said outright that the idea of the left has gone insane from Dave Rubin isn't quite correct. However, on college campuses like Oberlin College, social justice ideology drives small business out for virtue signaling. So then, if I can ask, why do you think that sort of the left has gone insane is an inadequate answer for a lot of the political strife that we see right now?
I think it's definitely a factor. I mean, I'm very simple. I mean, the reason I made the films about the IDW is that I'm sympathetic with that, to that perspective. I would have called myself a leftist all through my kind of adolescence and up until fairly recently, and I also feel a bit politically homeless that a lot of the ways that the left seems to behave now is not how I remember it behaving. I do wonder how, like, I think it's an open question, like how the fact that one bakery is closed down, what happened in Evergreen as well. I don't know if you've seen the amazing films by Mike Nainer about Brett Weinstein's experience on Evergreen. That for me is the most chilling example of how groupthink and sort of the ideology, like any ideology, can be taken to extremes and turn into a kind of authoritarian worldview. And I think that's definitely what's happening on a lot of college campuses. My question is, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this, I'm persuaded by people who say this is, have you heard the phrase nut picking? Which I think is great. It can be done on both sides. It's like on the right you kind of take the most extreme nutty examples of stuff on the left and assume that that's every college campus everywhere. And on the left you'll pick something that's like the most extreme example of something on the right and you assume that represents everyone. So how much of this is nut picking? How much of this is a genuine existential threat? I don't think it's completely blown out of proportion, because you do also see this ideology in, for example, the James Damore case with Google. I think that's a really interesting example of the HR department at a top organization basically running someone out for having what most people who looked at the actual science and the actual what he said could say that it was supported by the science, it was a perspective they'd asked for, he'd given it to them, and then he was made unemployed. So I think it is more than, and you look at something like the New York Times and you could argue that has gone a lot further left and a lot more kind of ideologically fixated over the last few years. But I'm genuine. I don't know how much of a problem it is.
Recently, Stephen Crowder, I don't know if you consider him a member of the IDW or whatnot, but he recently released a video regarding Tulsi Gabbard and how allegedly her videos are occasionally, when she's in a spotlight, essentially removed from the front page of YouTube, and sort of that being in connection to sort of big tech censoring in a way.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people are thinking that the censorship is going to ramp up a lot in the run-up to 2020. But then it was quite interesting that Mark Zuckerberg the other day pretty much took the opposite perspective. It's really hard to know. It's really hard to know what... We've had some videos monetized, for example. It's mostly been around gender, and we had a series called Men and Women After Me Too, and they got demonetized. What it seems likely, I've heard David Pakman talk really well about this, that what seems to be happening, so that they're not accused of political bias, what they're doing is they are mass demonetizing all of the small channels. So David Pakman, who's a left-leaning YouTuber, is having most of his stuff demonetized, or was like about a month ago. And so what he thinks is happening, so that they can avoid being accused of only targeting small conservative sites, is they're targeting all the small sites and basically directing people to the big news sites. So they're boosting MSNBC, they're boosting CNN, because they're the reputable sites, and they're downgrading everyone else. That seems to be the way that they're going to buy, because I think the tech companies are very, they definitely lean liberal in terms of their staff, but I think they're very, very wary of being seen as taking sides. So I think that's probably how they're going to get out of it. I don't know about the Tulsi Gabbard example specifically.
I wanted to add one thing to this, which is I think that, I've also been thinking about the IDW for a while. And obviously the central figures like Peterson and Harris are very polarizing, and I'm very interested in that fact, the fact that such figures are so polarizing. And once you get beyond the superficialities and discussions with people who differ on the IDW, one thing that I noticed again and again is that one of the fundamental disagreements seems to be on this question: is the intellectual dark web overstating the degree to which the radical left or the social justice left poses a threat to Western society? I have a professor, Steve Levitsky, who's like, maybe Amherst College is a little crazy, but that's not a microcosm of the United States. Interestingly, when Peterson came here, I put this question to him, and one of my critiques was, a lot of people say that actually the anti-immigration right may pose more of a threat to classical liberal values. And he actually conceded that point, strangely, and then explained his focus on the left by reference to his own personal experience in Canada at universities. So even some members of the IDW don't seem necessarily that clear on whether the left is really more of a problem than the right. To some extent, they're just acting on the basis of their own personal experience. So it seems to me that this is a core area of disagreement in our society. Some people think the left is a really big problem. Other people think that the right is just doing McCarthyism redux, with social justice work. And so I thought, before we proceed to Dan's question, if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was going to ask this question anyway, but you lead into it with, I think what I've heard a lot of the members of the IDW say, relating to your point, is that we in the West are very good at surrounding too far right ideas and saying they are bad ideas. Racism is bad, sexism is bad, anti-immigration is bad. And we haven't in Western culture, and this is their thought, this isn't my thought, so just putting it out there, surrounded the left's bad ideas well enough. And I would put that to both of you as what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about this quite a lot, and I think it's very... It's quite cleverly framed as well, because the left has problems, or the left has...
They dissolve.
They dissolve boundaries. The initial impulse of the left is to dissolve boundaries, dissolve borders, to dissolve categories between things. and so they find it difficult to delineate kind of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I think there's definitely some truth in that. My sense of what, like I can see why people think that the left is dangerous, because it's the kind of, if you think that identity politics is a danger on the right, which I think we all agree is, like, and Brett Weinstein made this point really clearly and got a lot of pushback for it. I think because of the optics of him talking about it after the controversy that he had at Evergreen. But he made the point that if you raise, so if identity politics is raised without also including the commonalities, and it's only emphasizing the differences, then what you're actually doing is the retribalization of society. And his point was that as an evolutionary biologist, if you emphasize just the differences, then what you'll end up doing is pushing people into those camps. And that is really catastrophic, because when things get difficult, that's what people are going to assume as their primary identity. And then as things are likely to get difficult in the next kind of 10 years or so, that's not a good route to go. But we all recognize that identity politics on the right is bad, but we all recognize that identity politics on the left, at least historically, has led to a lot of positive outcomes. The civil rights movement, so it's very difficult. Even then, it's even difficult to express, like, where does identity politics on the left start becoming a force for division, or where does it start becoming a force for equality? But and I don't know.
One thing I would add to that is, I don't know if you've heard Jonathan Haidt on this, but he actually has kind of specifically addressed this question, and he distinguishes between common humanity and common enemy identity politics, and says that the latter is bad. And he thinks that at least segments of the left are engaged in common enemy identity politics, again, rather than common humanity. That is, our group is being targeted in certain ways, and we are human just like you and deserve equality. In any case, so that might be one possible answer. Does anyone want to represent the point of view that there's a lot of exaggeration about how much of a problem the left is from people in the IDW? I mean, I'm guessing some people in the room probably think there's exaggeration.
Hi, so I guess you can say I'm the token representative of the social justice left at these events, typically speaking. I mean, I don't deny that there are problems, but I do think that there is an exaggeration. I think kind of an issue that I've come to see as the root of, I think, a lot of the IDW's criticisms of the social justice left is simply attributed to a lack of nuance. I think a lot of the, like, kind of overextension of cancel culture and like kind of these more divisional politics comes out of just a lack of nuance and understanding the arguments of the social justice left and of identity politics. And I think that a lack of nuance is not an issue that's exclusive to the social justice left. I think that is kind of more broad-based, just kind of across the board. But I do think that, as it I guess should be, if you want to use that language, as it should be, I don't think that there's really issues with the social justice left and with identity politics. I think the issue comes with just a lack of nuance and understanding that, in like your quick reactionary snap judgments and, oh, this person said this like one thing one time, so nothing they ever say is valid anymore. Like that kind of stuff I see a problem with. And I think that is kind of confounded with the entirety of the social justice left. And every time I say that, I feel like I have to use air quotes.
Yeah, can I just say one thing to that? Just because I think both Douglas Murray and Sam Harris talk well about this, the idea that we've got these mythopoetic and religious frameworks. And I think it's when we replace one with another without realizing that's what we've done. And the idea that, at least with the Christian framework, when you sin, there's a kind of repentance. Where's the repentance in kind of modern cancel culture? When you've said something 12 years ago on social media and you've apologized for it, and then it's brought up again, we're not equipped to deal with that. And there is this sort of sense of we're using these kind of deep religious frameworks to make sense of the world without realizing we're doing it. And there's no possibility of kind of forgiveness almost.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times the entirety of, again, air quotes for the mic, the social justice left is kind of assumed to not have any sort of like restorative or like rehabilitative parts to it, of like, you know, you can learn from your mistakes, you can, you know, grow over time and change your beliefs and change your actions. So I think that is a large part of it, which is one of the reasons that I think there is an exaggeration from the IDW of how terrible the left is and things like that. So
yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I'm not entirely on the SJW left, but air quotes. But I think one of the biggest for me things that sort of undermines the validity of the IDW is sort of for each and every almost every one of the actors that's sort of a prime player in the intellectual dark web. They all are direct products of the cancel culture of the left. So there's heavy motivated reasoning for them to sort of exaggerate that point. And I talk about, like, with Peterson being cancelled at Toronto, with Brett being cancelled at Evergreen, with Sam Harris, Peter Boghossian, and I think all of them have this heavy motivated reasoning to sort of come to that point.
Also the phrase political PTSD, I've heard. I would define it, well, could one of the reasons that Jordan Peterson is extremely reactive to the social justice left is because of his experience over 2 years at Toronto, where he could have lost his job and he was on final warnings, and is that why he's seeing so many, or he's so exercised by that side of things? That would be political PTSD, I'd say. You're hyper-vigilant to the thing that has hurt you, in the same way that you're hyper-vigilant to loud bangs if you've been in a war zone and stuff.
That's pretty much the point. Like, there's heavy motivated reasoning, and there's, I say, a real lack of people who came to it by sort of genuine research. And like, I think Haidt sort of straddles that line, but equally has some faults in that regard. Like, there's some arguments that he equally had some investigation that really moved him. Prior to that point, he was really against it for very different reasons. And I think there's really the strong argument for motivated reasoning being the fact that they continue to exaggerate, and just then the cycle of sort of profitability from that and all that sort of creating the essence of it. There's also a deliberate ignoring of the sort of like the right threat. A breaking point for me is just seeing was when Peterson tweeted with regards to Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, when he tweeted if Kavanaugh even is confirmed, he should resign. Just sort of, and there was like huge backlash on that point from the right, and he eventually sort of like took a step back and sort of reframed it just to seem more accommodating of the right. And I think a lot of the motivation, one, sort of profit-wise, and two, sort of like having sort of received a backlash from the left, continues to shape their dialogue and sort of conversation around the integrity of the IDW in that sense seems to be up in question.
On a more practical note, I feel like people on the left have a better ability to, how do I say, make a public profile. So you have these celebrities, these politicians that are really good at making or fabricating in some cases a public profile that like fits to a public opinion. So you have this collective of people. Do I have anyone in mind? Basically every singer ever.
Robert Downey Jr.
Yes.
Taylor Swift. Wait until you have a mic.
I don't want to name call. Yeah. I don't want to name call, but I would just say, from my observation, I need data to be correct. But then again, I feel like there are so many people on the left who are better at creating a public kind of profile. So we see the left as this like collective, and when you see a collective versus some individuals on the right, you feel like the collective is more like is stronger. It's like a 5 versus 1 situation, and you feel like you have to have these underdog heroes to fight off the collective, and in a sense that makes the left looks more dangerous, looks more like vigilant, and I feel like that's also one of the like factors that play a role in like making this picture a little bit like misrepresented.
Andrew Breitbart had that quote, "Politics is downstream from culture." And so part of the argument that the right will make about why the left poses a threat is that they're dominating culture. Like, they're dominating pop culture, they're dominating Hollywood. Almost all of the relevant actors or musical artists, the ones who are more on the right side of the political spectrum are to some extent like marginalized, ostracized, don't really speak up that much. So if you think that politics is downstream from culture, I guess the idea is that our politics are ultimately going to reflect. Yeah. In any case, so Dan, and then Chuck.
Well, I suppose this will fold into the discussion we've just been having, but it seems interesting to me, and correct me if I'm wrong about the timing, but the IDW, such as it is, sort of formed in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election in the United States. And, I mean, we had certainly a lot of tension on our campus even here. We had a speaker in support of Trump after the election. There was a huge outcry, and my understanding is that the IDW looked at, or the members in it and the people who supported it, all the YouTube commenters, looked at this situation and said, there's too much incivility, people aren't talking to each other, they're not having long-form discussions, it's too polarized. But what's fascinating to me is it seems like no one in the IDW, I think no one in this discussion has said the word Trump hardly at all. And, this goes into the left-right thing, but, there are angry leftists in Oberlin, and there are cultural figures, and then there is the President of the United States, and I don't think that's nut-picking. He's the most powerful man in the world, and he has a party and a unified media apparatus that is, in fact, Fox News is the most watched mainstream news network in the world. So my question is just, I have, I think my question sort of shows my own political biases here, but I've tried to feel as charitable as possible towards the IDW. But I can't help looking at a group of people who claim to combat sort of the erosion of civil discourse and omit, the mainstream politician who I think probably since the Civil War is most corrosive to civil discourse in like the advanced Western world. So, I know we talked about people being siloed, but do you have a charitable explanation for that besides cognitive biases, which I think is probably the most reasonable charitable explanation?
Well, Sam Harris, what you just said about Trump, Sam Harris, I've heard him say almost those exact words as well. Eric and Brett have spoken out against Trump. Dave Rubin hasn't, for whatever reasons. He hasn't decided to do that. He actually did. This is, if you watch the Timber on Toast films, he actually did do a sort of lukewarm criticism of Trump, and then immediately on the next show did a kind of apology, mea culpa, to his audience for doing that. Even though he said at the beginning, if Trump, I'll hold Trump's feet to the fire, and he never has. That I think is sort of financial reasons, because a lot of his big time supporters I know are going to be sort of quite hard anti-left, hard right supporters. So I don't think there's a unified perspective in the IDW. I know in the Glitch in the Matrix 2, Eric said that we've broken from, something like we've broken from tradition with Trump, but it's in the wrong way. And it's unsustainable. He's terrifying. So Peterson hasn't really spoken out against Trump. He's kind of obliquely said that he thinks the same as everyone else does about Trump. It doesn't feel there'd be any use in saying anything. So I do think there are different perspectives within it, but I'm trying to think who else is kind of in the centre of it. Shapiro, yeah. Shapiro. Yeah, I've always kind of been unsure about Shapiro in the IDW. Honestly, I feel like he was put in there by Eric to kind of show that there was a conservative in the IDW. That was kind of the main. I've always assumed that. I don't know that, but So, they don't speak out about it so much, and I think it's interesting what Brandon was saying about even Jordan Peterson thinks that there's a different political situation in the US compared to Canada, where he says, the left is certainly more concerning in Canada, but in America, you're in a very different political.
Yeah, he describes the US as having a healthy left-right balance. He's worried about Europe being a little tilted to the right, I think. I think so. I got that impression from his answer. I certainly don't want to put words in his mouth, but when I asked him at Lafayette about this critique that he's exaggerating the threat posed by the left, he said, well, yeah, Europe has some different issues. They've had this large influx of immigration, and so that has activated the more ethno-nationalist right to a greater degree than you see even in the United States, which has also had a lot of mass immigration. It's interesting. He thinks that we have a very strong right impulse in this country and a strong left impulse, and so from that kind of paradoxical perspective, I think he thinks that the U.S. might be better off than Canada and Europe, and that there's more of a balance. Here's Chuck.
All right, so my question is, if some of the largest members of the intellectual dark web were to eventually, get to the point where they their following passes off mainstream media, or maybe they become part of the mainstream media. Like, let's say someday Ben Shapiro got a show at Fox News. Would that ruin the integrity of the intellectual dark web?
It's a good question. I mean, that was one of the failure conditions that was named early on by some of the figures within it, which is that they could be bought off, they could be kind of knocked off, criticized. Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether it still retains a sort of coherence anyway as it stands. I'm not sure that it does. I think it was a moment in time. I think that the values that it was constellated around have crystallized into a kind of tribal ideology. You've got people who are not in that original article, like someone mentioned Peter Boghossian, the sort of grievance scholars. You've got other people who are kind of considered part of it, and they seem more to be like the IDW crowd. I don't think are any more. They're not pushing beyond the polarization. I don't believe. I think they're another tribe within a kind of fragmented tribal landscape.
They're one of the mimetic tribes?
Yeah, I'd say they're one of the mimetic tribes based around free speech, based around, in sort of Ken Wilber's language, kind of orange values, trying to recover the sort of orange values that are being lost in a kind of relativistic society.
I would also define the IDW, going back to what Saeed said. I think Saeed said something, I've had the same thought, which is that the IDW has two characteristics. The first characteristic is a characteristic that I think almost all of us either share or should share, which is the view that mainstream media does a really shitty job often of like discussing the issues that matter to us in a smart, helpful, nuanced way. But then they also have this additional characteristic, which is that they have a special animus toward the quote-unquote social justice left, rooted largely in personal experience. And the thing is, there are a lot of people out there who are totally on board with point one, that mainstream media is bad, or it's like not doing a good job, but who don't have a particular animus toward the social justice left. And like the IDW is limited in the sense that I think ideally the conversations would be broader between all people who agree that mainstream media is falling short. But you know, some of them might have a special animus for the ethno-nationalist right, like Dan Markovitz. Yeah. Are you suggesting that there's historical reason to be worried about the ethno-nationalist right? Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up a couple of points regarding whether or not the IDW's focus on the left is exaggerated, and I really actually don't think it is. I think, and I don't think it's the political PTSD either, because I think that's actually sort of selling it short. Peterson has said right from the beginning that it was his focus for many, many years as to how we could have had Hitler and the excesses of the right and many of the problems that happened in the 20th century. So it had nothing to do really with the fallout from the videos that he made, and everything to do with what he had been working on for 30 years. And a lot of the members were already talking about that are considered in the IDW, or were already talking about things before Trump got elected anyhow. Who would be a member of the IDW is, I think, accurate, and why people get so excited about this is regarding Ryan Bennett's tweets that you posted up there. So I'm getting excited about this because I think it's unfair to sort of undermine a lot of the work that they've done, because in particular, it's the conversation that happens around mainstream media that's so poor, like the BBC thing and the Kathy Newman interview that illustrates so completely how the disregard that they have for the intelligence of their audience. And it's Dave Rubin's style to allow his interlocutor, which is different than the Kathy Newman thing, which is so intellectually dishonest and disrespectful of her audience, to keep peppering him with these kind of devil's advocate kind of questions that are just so obviously false, where Dave Rubin just sits back and allows his guest enough rope, as he said in the interview that you had with him, to if they're not a master of their own thoughts, to hang themselves. And that's what's so wonderful about the conversations that all of them are having independently with other people. And I think it's really unfair of you, I'm sorry, but other people that are criticizing the IDW to say that they don't have conversations with people that criticize them, because they certainly do. And so you might do something unfairly, like have a little clip of him talking to Stefan Molyneux, and then catch him in one little incident that he doesn't quite remember, and he's just done hundreds and hundreds of hours, thousands of hours of interviews with other people. How in the world is he supposed to remember if he said, I don't even remember what I had for lunch? I mean, it's just so unfair and so disingenuous. And whether the left has gone too far, I mean, MMT, modern monetary theory, that AOC is sort of threatening to just print indefinitely to fund her things. I mean, you could just go on forever whether or not they represent a threat. If you have Fox, you have every other media channel that represents the left, and they're doing a really bad job, as you might say. And I'm not going to just monopoly. I can go on for like an hour about what a threat they really do represent. And Keynesian economics, that almost every nation in the world is suffering with a deficit that threatens to bankrupt them. It's horrible. Venezuela, I mean, Jesus. I can't believe that anyone could possibly say that they're over-exaggerating the threat that the left represents. In some ways, I just think what's so wonderful about them is that they're bringing a conversation that other people haven't heard. If you turn on the radio station and listen to any kind of leftist, they are peppering the thing again and again and again. It's like relentless. If anybody's relentless, it's the news media on the left. And I think I'll leave it there because I could just take over.
I think you actually do have more of a, like, talk radio goes back quite a long time in the US. Like, you have much more polarized media on both sides than we do in, certainly on the right. For example, Fox News couldn't exist in the UK. We have quite strict broadcasting rules. You've had Rush Limbaugh going back a long time. Like, I do think there is quite a strong, you do have quite strong right-wing voices in America in a way that we don't really have. Like our tabloid press in the UK is quite right-leaning, but we don't have our broadcast rules are much more strict. I'd say just on the Dave Rubin point, I would recommend watching the Timber films because it's not, oh, you have? Yeah, oh, great, yeah. Great. Yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem with him talking to whoever he wants to talk to. I'd be interested because you also said that you think that they do speak a lot to people they disagree with. Which interviews are you thinking in particular? He spoke to you. He wouldn't have spoken to me if he knew what the interview I was going to do was. And he won't speak to me again now.
Just so the camera gets it, so Dorian pointed out that Dave Rubin did speak to David Fuller, noted left-wing journalist. I'm just kidding.
Well, no, he was very, very upset with the interview I did with him, even though I actually think it was a very good. I don't think he came off that badly in it. I thought it was a very punchy interview. It was a very direct interview, but I didn't think that he embarrassed himself by any means, and I don't think I asked him any questions that were out of order. But he was very upset about it. He actually asked me not to put it up. And then we've had no contact since, even though I'd be more than happy to do another interview with him. So he was very, very upset with the fact that the interview went the way that it did, felt betrayed by it and all the rest of it. I don't see that many interviews with members of the IDW speaking to people they disagree with, and I'd love to do that. I mean, their central point is that there's disagreement within the IDW. And Dave Rubin has been saying for a long time, look, I've had Brett Weinstein on my show. And it's like, yeah, but you agree, you've had him on your show to talk about how bad the left is and what happened to him at Evergreen. So if you agree about this sort of central point, which I think most of them do, then those other disagreements sort of pale into insignificance to some degree. where are the dialogues with people who disagree about something that's actually fundamental to your identity or fundamental to your belief system?
Why do you think those dialogues aren't happening? Because just taking Peterson, for example, it strikes me that he would talk to literally anyone who expressed an interest in talking to him. I could be wrong, but
yeah.
For example, like he would talk to Ezra
that.
Klein, or
I'd love to see that.
I would too.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a great conversation.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to say to Dorian, one interesting case study regarding Rubin is how he reacted to the Quillette article. Did you read the Uri Harris article criticizing Dave Rubin? And it struck me as a good faith criticism and a fairly cogent one that Dave Rubin could have used as an opportunity to model civil disagreement, and instead seemed to regard the author of this critique as like a bad faith actor, and that made me kind of sympathetic to the general point that Fuller is making, or that David is making.
There's a disagreement over here.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah, on the point of, I think it's a broader point that should be shared is that the disagreement amongst the members of the IDW could be made a little bit more pronounced. Shapiro and Rubin. Shapiro sat in Rubin's garage, someone who is anti-homosexual because of his religious beliefs. Rubin's married to a man. Harris and Peterson famously had multiple debates, hours-long debates, where they really didn't solve any of their differences. Harris had a podcast with Klein that you mentioned. They vehemently disagreed with one another. So I take that a little bit with a grain of salt. I do think the IDW does do a good job of looking at different opinions and talking those through. Shapiro had Piers Morgan on the Sunday special. I mean, they're famously fighting it out on CNN a couple years ago. So there's plenty of.
There's a good point that my friend Jay Shapiro makes as well. So Jay Shapiro, no relation to Ben, did the film with Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz, the Islam and the Future of Tolerance, and he made the good point that there's a whole load of stuff just lying around on the floor of the IDW that could be that could be addressed, like abortion, like hugely different perspectives on abortion, and some of them are more valid than others, make more sense than others, and they're not really touching those. So I think there is, even within those issues, there are topics that haven't really been fully explored. So I'd agree with that.
It seems like in a lot of ways the intellectual dark web has sort of, for lack of a better term, gone dark in a way, where in some ways sort of the conversation that was so boisterous and so loud in 2016, 2017, beginning of 2018 is starting to die down a little bit more. Do you think that that's more because of the natural ebb and flow of the sort of political process and how a lot of it is rather U.S. centric, or would you say that there's something else to say sort of about the stagnation of the IDW in the last year?
Yeah, I mean, specifically around the IDW, I think one of the factors that I didn't mention in my talk was Pangburn philosophy. So Pangburn were the hosts for the Sam Harris-Jordan Peterson debate, and then they also had a couple of big debates in Australia, and then they basically bankrupted themselves over one that didn't happen in New Zealand, and then they had this thing called the Day of Reckoning, which was going to happen in New York, and initially it was going to be $500 for the event, and it was Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, like kind of everyone, and eventually it just became clear that the people who'd had their tickets cancelled in Auckland weren't getting their money back. It was clear it wasn't going to happen, and they all started pulling out one by one. So a lot of those debates, they also hosted Brett Weinstein and Richard Dawkins for a really interesting debate about evolution that a lot of people said moved that discipline forward quite a bit. So when they went under in a really public way. A lot of that initiative, a lot of the impetus for the big public events went away. Like that I think had a real impact on it in terms of the public focus and the public profile of it. And then I think the other reasons I think, for me, it's some of the things that I sketched out. Like I don't really see them, I don't see any real strategic perspective in terms of what are the conversations that need to be had. For example, someone suggested Klein and Harris talking again, but that being mediated by someone else, because they basically got into this kind of real fight with each other, and it's like, is there a way through that conversation? Because I don't know if who's heard that here. Like I found it really difficult to pass. Like I agreed with Klein at some points, I agreed with Harris at some points, and I know that Harris felt like really that Klein was kind of a bad faith actor and all the rest of it. I didn't get that sense from that conversation. So I'd love to, could there be someone who could moderate that conversation for them? Like a lot of those high profile conversations about some of these hot topics are not being had. And I think there needs to be a bit more strategy about who are the people to have those conversations and how do we move. If what we have are these sort of stuck ideas and stuck disciplines, which is what Brett and Eric keep going on about, okay, how do you unstick them? Who are the people that need to have those high profile conversations to move things forward?
One of the things regarding what you just said is one of the reasons why I think that Dave Rubin and a lot of the IDW sort of threw Stefan Molyneux under the bus and disassociated themselves with him is because he was having that conversation about radioactive topics like IQ. And that's one of the reasons there are certain topics that will never get covered on mainstream media. And if you bring them up, you have a mob like attacking you. You can't talk anywhere. You get deplatformed anywhere you go. You know, if you're entertaining like Milo and you happen to talk about things, you know, they're out to get you. And that's one of the reasons why if you want to say that they're not actually doing, the IDW is actually not doing a job that they might be doing, we wouldn't be having this conversation if they weren't. I mean, there's a certain residual ripple effect that happens where so many people across the country and the world are having a conversation because of their efforts. And so that I would say it's stronger today. The world is a better place today because of the conversations that they've been having. And regarding that conversation with Ezra Klein, well, I think he was, you know, like dishonest. And so perhaps you're right. It would be good to have like some kind of mediator, because some of those topics you just can't talk about. And so who's going to platform those topics? You have it here and it blows up. You have it anywhere and it blows up. How are you going to do that? That's one of those excesses of the left. So yeah, they are excessive.
Yeah, I thought he was. I also, when I listened to the Klein-Harris discussion, I thought that you can't prove it, right? But I thought Klein was sort of cowardly and inauthentic. That's how it came off to me. But it seems like there's a lot of disagreement on that. Also, Molyneux, I think, goes back to a point you made, Mike. He's one of those guys that the right demarcated as outside the Overton window because he talks about race realism all the time.
It's not the only reason that he was put outside the Overton window. If you read up about his free domain radio, so he basically is a fan of this thing called defooing, which is cutting out your family of origin. And there's a lot of history of him and his wife, I think, basically encouraging people to cut off contact with their families. Like, it's pretty close to being a cult.
That's unfair too, because you have you can't just give one side of the argument. It's for people that have been sexually molested that are still attached. It's for extenuating circumstances that are so horrible when you can't have a conversation. If they're not going to apologize, if you can't speak to them, if it's so horrible, then yeah, maybe you shouldn't be speaking to them anymore because it's damaging you psychologically. He doesn't just say, you know, join my cult. That's really just not fair.
I didn't say he said join the cult. I said it's a bit culty. I'd say for me, Molyneux is creepy, strange, and has some very, very peculiar ideas that he's inflicting on other people, and I think he's pretty damaging, personally. That's my conclusion. I wouldn't want to have the conversation with him, personally. I wouldn't want to boost his signal in any way.
That's what you're asking the IDW to do. That's what you're asking the IDW to do, to have conversation with people that they might not agree with, and
yeah,
startlingly might not agree with.
Yeah, but I do think that I'm not a free speech absolutist, I do think that some people are beyond the pale, and I think that personally, I wouldn't want to see Stefan Molyneux's signal boosted in any way.
So I haven't heard anything yet that you're putting forth that puts him beyond the pale.
Well, you can boost his signal then. I've heard enough to put it beyond the pale for me. And that's the thing with these freedom of speech issues. Ultimately, you can't have rules that apply to everyone. my sense as a journalist and as a human being is that he's not someone that I would want to boost in any way.
But you wouldn't favor laws preventing him from speaking, right? You're just saying as a private, yeah.
But I do think if I did, people would then be able to make their judgments about me, about my editorial judgment, about my and they'd be able to make that decision.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's what happens in conversation, you know. But regarding the examples that you have put forth, like tonight, I haven't heard anything that labels him as so terrible.
Is there anything that would?
Well, let me just add to. I mean, so
I want to hear because I like.
Do you think that conversations about racial differences and IQ should be part of the public discourse? Because he talks a ton about that, and I think that, I mean, maybe defooing is big, but I think that his focus on race and IQ is the main reason why are just like he's outside the Overton window. Wait, and so you're saying you don't think that should be outside the Overton window? Is that what you're saying? Like,
right? Yes.
I mean, the other part is, the question is whether that particular topic is outside the Overton window. And I'd be interested to see what Brett Weinstein might have to say to him. I wouldn't want to have Stefan Molyneux on to talk about that particularly because I don't know anything about it. I've got no frame of reference to be able to hold those ideas to account. If those are, and they are very dangerous ideas, you need someone who's actually able to hold those ideas to account.
It seems like the one thing most people can agree upon is that media is generally crappy. You know, some people might hate Fox News more than MSNBC or vice versa, but it's short, it doesn't go into depth into things. But it seems like whatever is in the media, even if we don't like it very much, it's relatively popular, right? There's not, like, I'm sure there's some unfair business practices, but these aren't huge monopolies. These are extraordinarily popular, right? You see over and over again more controversial news anchors, more polemicists, people are taking over, and, you know, you've talked about audience capture. It seems like the IDW people go out and say something nuanced and they get 5 YouTube views, and they go out and say something offensive and they get 500 YouTube views. So I guess I'd just ask, like, do you think they were sort of doomed from the start by that? Or, like, is there a way to manufacture an audience in these incredibly polarized times that really does want nuance and, like, bipartisanship? Because there just doesn't seem to be one. So isn't it sort of better to just sort of roll with the polarization and try and make the best you can out of it rather than, like, it seems like pretending to be nonpartisan or non-polarized in economic and audience circumstances where that simply isn't possible is just going to lead to people being disingenuous?
There's a lot in there. Is there a market for nuance? I hope that we're trying to find out with Rebel Wisdom. All of the incentives are pulling in certain directions online. And that's for sure. The question of whether the centre can hold is the really big one, and I don't know what the answer is to that. But also, those same incentives are now acting on the mainstream media as well. I mean, you're seeing a lot more clickbait coming out of mainstream media outlets that previously weren't that clickbaity. So I think, and that kind of, you could argue that kind of downward spiral of the mainstream media as they're kind of fighting for audience share is actually far more of an impact on society than YouTube and some of the polarization that happens on there. I don't know if you can quantify it, but it's certainly the case that as they start to lose audience share, they seem to be getting more and more left or more and more right because that's where the audience, they think they can get more of the audience. I would want to say a word for the mainstream media, having worked in it for quite a long time, and I think it's very easy to get cheap props for dismissing the mainstream media. I've worked with a lot of really amazing journalists. I've worked with people risking their lives in Syria. I've worked with people kind of really passionately covering, like making it their vocation to tell the world stories as well as possible. And I think without, like, genuinely, I'm scared of what will happen when we lose all of that, and if we are going to increasingly lose all of that, because I think we're going to miss it terribly when it's gone.
Yeah, I made a pretty cheap dig earlier, now that I think about it. Sorry about that. It sounds like one defining feature of the IDW is that they all think that the world is moving in a bad or at least dangerous direction, and what makes Steven Pinker not a member of the IDW is that he has this very optimistic Yeah, right. Okay. So I was just curious what people here think about that. Like, do you guys think the world is moving in a good or bad direction right now? And second, do you guys agree that this is an age in which we don't believe anything other than scientific statements, and therefore our lives lack meaning, and we're kind of in a period of nihilism?
Is anyone familiar with John Vervaeke's work here? He talks about his series is called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So I think that's a really interesting frame to look at it as the meaning crisis. We're all looking for meaning, and we're finding it in either in these sort of secular ideologies or.
I'm sorry, that was John Waite?
John Vervaeke, Vervaeke. He's actually also at University of Toronto in the psychology department. So he's like a couple of doors down from Jordan Peterson. But his main topic is, I think, Buddhism and cognitive science. So he kind of does a lot more embodied practice, Tai Chi, mindfulness, stuff like that.
I heard you say that his intellectual journey after Peterson's was the one that you found most interesting. I don't know if you continue to believe that, but I remember hearing you say that and being struck by it, and that's what led
Jordan Hall says that he's the most compelling, he's the most essential thinker to be across if you want to make sense of the world in the next 5 years or so.
When you made that point about Pinker, I didn't really agree with it on the basis that I think Peterson and like most of them would actually agree with Pinker. Like, and I've seen most of them actually retweet Pinker's works, especially like I remember when the New York Times came out with an article sort of saying that these are the good things that there was like this, I can't remember, this website that sort of shows like the good things in the world right now, and I think like a lot of that, like especially when the Enlightenment book came out, a lot of them really retweeted it and stuff like that. It might be on different sectors they think this world is sort of leaping forward, and like in terms of like they always argue that, well, in science and technology and sort of like the fact, and Peterson always talks about the fact that we're all just sitting next to each other and not punching each other at this very moment is a marvel of like liberalism and all that type of stuff. So I think like there's that whole arena with regards to sort of like talking about like just the way society is constructed, but at the same time they think, well, there's two fronts to it. It's not necessarily like the world as a whole is at a bad place, and I think they draw that distinction in like sort of like they're like, well, science and technology, the fact that we have planes, Peterson always says, that's a really big deal. But I just think that like when it comes to things of like where they think is like the culture in sort of like not like the values and ideas that sort of they think are foundational and sort of still sort of are reducing, but they think in general on a larger scale everything's going well in these small in these pockets or on these playing fields, like culturally, especially with regards to sort of like how we're thinking about there's a huge crisis, and they do state that crisis very aptly. It's like, we're in a very bad situation in that regard. So I'm a little hesitant to sort of draw like a Weinstein versus like a Pinker type IDW, and I do think Pinker was dragged into the IDW sort of just by virtue of sort of like having the ideas that sort of correlate to sort of like correspond to, and to some degree at some point embraced that sort of like picture, because like a lot of the people, at least on the underbellies of the IDW, like Saloni and like a couple of the Twitter heads were like all Pinker heads, and when the book came out, I think that was a really like central point of discussion for the IDW for a while. And even on Quillette, for example, which is like, let's say, a blog for like the IDW, came like a conversation. So I don't think I wouldn't even draw that distinction. I'd say, well, they actually do agree on those fundamental premises that the world is at the best place it is, and as such, the acts of the left right now are threatening to sort of derail that sort of progress, or sort of like the best place that the world has been.
I think it's one of the hardest. There's the phrase that a mature mind is able to hold different truths at the same time. And I think that truth that we're in both sort of the best time to be alive and we're in a seriously destabilizing situation, I think are both true. I think just saying that the left is the biggest issue, for me as a foreign affairs journalist, I look at what Trump is now doing to all of the kind of global systems, from the NATO to the UN to this whole kind of international, the assumptions that were, and the institutions that were set up after the Second World War to keep the peace. I think he's kind of taking a wrecking ball to, and I look at like what happened just removing the troops from Syria recently, like all of the destabilization that's going on around the world. And I think that for me looks like a kind of collapse dynamic. We're going back into sort of great power dynamics. We're going back into a multipolar world, and that terrifies me, for example. So there's a lot of destabilizing stuff going on. I think you're right, certainly, that there is, and I think I kind of said that in my talk, there's a split within the IDW, and I think some would agree with Pinker more, and some would agree with Eric and Brett more. Like Eric and Brett definitely believe that we're in a seriously destabilizing situation, and things are heading for really difficult times. And quite a lot. So we've interviewed quite a lot of other people since these articles, since these pieces, and that seems to be fairly universal. Like I'm torn. I don't know what I believe in this, and I actually want to do a whole series about sort of collapse dynamics. But a lot of the most impressive people I've interviewed are fairly convinced that we're because of exponential technology on a finite playing field, we are looking at a system that has probably got 10, 15 years maximum in its current state, and we need to start thinking about something that's going to replace it. And I'm persuaded by that, just because these are some of the smartest people I've met.
Could you elaborate on anyone?
Doing our next series of films are about that. I'm still kind of learning about it. A guy called Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about it a lot. He basically says exponential tech on a finite playing field is just taking game theoretic dynamics, which is like game theory includes like multipolar trap, race to the bottom, the tragedy of the commons, all of that stuff. And exponential tech is just speeding up that process of existential risk. And also we're getting ever increasing access to existential threats like bioweapons, nuclear power, nuclear weapons. All of these things are getting more and more and more available to non-state actors. So if you fast forward 10, 15 years, we're at a point where just a small number of bad actors can cause immense amounts of damage. All of those different sort of factors kind of happening at the same time, which I'm kind of persuaded by. But I'm also, I also have some kind of, the idea, I'm also aware that, not having gratitude for where we're at and what we've managed to achieve is kind of, that has to be part of the picture as well.
To the question of if we're going in the wrong direction, I'd personally answer yes. It should be important to express first, I might possibly have political PTSD just from, I'm a transfer student from Oberlin College specifically, and I spent a year there.
Yeah, just the Oberlin example, would you say that was expected given the tone of everything on campus, or?
I think the best explanation as to why all of it happened was I think the correct variables at the right time, where essentially you had the day after the 2016 election, after an incredibly racially divisive election as well. Essentially, three people going into a bakery, one person tried to go in, buy alcohol underage. That person then tried to shoplift the alcohol, and then he beat up the shop owner. And then two of his friends helped beat up the shop owner as well. All three of them were arrested for shoplifting, and then, just for context as well. And then the problem was that the store owner was white, and then the three kids that were arrested were black, so it was obviously racial profiling. They found against Oberlin College, correct. Originally 11 million, then it went up to 44, and now it's down to 25. So it's definitely ping-ponged around a bit. But the reason why I think it's going downhill in a way is because of the fact that in a lot of ways, sort of the postmodern ideas and sort of, I think, intersectionality have been in large part accepted. Sort of, as you've said, they've resulted in great social change, like voting and all of that for populations that had never had it in the past. Sort of right now, we live in the most equal time in sort of the state of like our history.
There is also a question whether intersectionality is the same thing that fueled the civil rights movement. And a lot of people
I don't think it is.
So it may not be the same factor.
Fair enough. I mean, in some ways, I think that it certainly is, because sort of the idea of intersectionality is just looking at identities and how those can affect your lived experience and all of that. And I think that in focusing especially on like minorities and like it's given a lot of credence and a lot of identity for minorities, but I think that there are certain people and large majorities and wide swaths that are just sort of left alone in a way. And I think sort of the most prominent example of that would be white men in a lot of ways. I know it's been like talked about in I think Peterson's brought it up a couple times, but what you have, the suicide rate for men is 3.5 times higher than women, for instance. And then suicide is also the second leading cause of death for men between, I think, 18 and 35. And then in addition to that, you also have, at least in the United States, a lot of mass shooters at the same time. They're obviously very, very angry with the system itself and very, very angry about what's going on. And then they're disillusioned, and we're to the point where they are so mentally warped they go out and commit absolute horrible mass shootings. And so I think that sort of that combination where you have these people that have been left out in the cold, and you have so many people that are starting to become more and more equal and starting to become a lot more involved in civil society, I think has led to sort of people that used to be in that sort of higher order, just because for the wide span of history, white men did most of like politics and history. So at least I'd argue that sort of that intersectionality needs to include not just oppressed identities, but I think also quote-unquote oppressor identities, where people need to be able to explore their identities without judgment, in a way, in some cases, in order to actually work through some of those feelings of existential angst.
How would that work, that someone would work through their kind of...
Well, I think that if you were to look in a lot of ways where at least now a lot of times there are like a lot of white men that have sort of come up against, had brushes with cancel culture in large swaths. And so like you have these people that maybe say one thing and it's in their Twitter from a couple years ago, and then a coworker goes in, finds this tweet, shows the boss, and then the boss fires that person. And like there's just sort of that resentment that's there. And I think that in order to allow people to explore that, you need to say, okay, it's clear that you were wronged here. Right now, like the psychology of men just isn't working. Like men are just sort of breaking, quote unquote, where they're killing themselves or like committing acts of mass violence. And so I think with that, you need to allow space for, I think, men, especially white men, to sort of talk about, okay, this is maybe what I've gone through in some ways, and then maybe try to restructure some of the things that have caused that to happen. And I think that one point that I will give the intersectional left is that sort of the point of toxic masculinity and how society can very much hammer home like very overly hypermasculine ideals in the media and all of that, I think has been some part of the cause. But I think the only way that we fix that is stopping sort of the stigma of that sort of toxic masculinity and trying to instead change it for the better and change it so that people aren't in such mental and existential anguish.
Yeah, no, it's a topic that's quite close to my heart, because I also run men's retreats. So, and we see quite a lot of men, younger men especially now, with kind of quite a bit of sense of shame around themselves as men. Like they're not sure what it means to be masculine or what it means to be a man in today's society, and it's something that I think I sense more of a compassion than there was. I think like if you got sort of strict intersectionality that just says, well, all men are kind of in this kind of hierarchy, all men are above women, so we need to kind of reinstall that. We need to demolish this hierarchy. Whereas a kind of more intelligent way says, okay, we're all affected in different ways by these gender roles. Men are having to be strong. Men are having to not show their feelings. And now there's also this tendency that I'm very concerned about, which is that men are seen as just being faulty women, and there's this kind of, or suffering from testosterone poisoning. There was a sense of sort of masculine virtue in the past, and it's like, well, maybe that does need to be updated, but I do think there needs to be something there that we all feel proud about, wherever we're from.
I would argue that we are in a stage where we are trying to find those masculine qualities that we can, is venerate the right word? Respect, yeah. I think a lot of masculine qualities in the past have also been very restrictive to men. Going back to Graham's point, white men shooting themselves, killing themselves, suicide, committing mass atrocities, I think that's more of a call for counseling and the acceptance of counseling rather than a harsh reality that men are being oppressed or that men are being degraded for having male characteristics or being a man. I think the issue is honestly that in the past we were working out female identity and then racial identity, and we still are working on that, but I think male identity will be needed to talk more about in the future, and in a way that we don't talk down to you guys. I'm saying this as a female, and not villainize you. I think we can't say that white men are the white men of the past, but we can say white men can be the white men of the future. You know, you can create your own identity, and not in a way that's going to be oppressive to you. And I think that's going to be talked about.
Yeah, I mean, just the first point you made about counselling, there's some really great articles recently about how counselling often doesn't work as well for men. It's quite a feminine, it's often quite a feminine space, and what works a lot better for men sometimes is doing stuff together. Like there was a few tips for working with teenage boys, for example, which is actually going outside, tossing a ball to each other, going for a walk. Like it's much related. For example, emotions are much more related to the spatial awareness part of the brain in men, whereas women are much more comfortable sitting down, kind of talking about things.
Yeah, definitely like looking into the study of how men and women's brains work differently, but I think what you talked about with the counseling and men not having it as effective, I think that is still part of our culture towards men to kind of bottle things in. And I'm not a man, so I don't know your experiences, so I hope I'm not speaking for you, but I think culture and society and maybe even your parents were like, hold it in, you know, be a man. I think we still need to grapple with that. I think that's going to be one of our next biggest issues that we're going to have to go against, among a variety of others, but we can't leave out white men. We can't villainize them because that's not a way to go forward.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is sort of the meaning crisis thing that we talked about before, because a lot of the rise in suicide is in sort of the Rust Belt states and the opioid crisis and all of that kind of causes. What I actually see, I mean, I actually think that my generation and younger, I find a lot of the men it might just be those are the ones that we're kind of attracting, but a lot of them are, I'm surprised by how kind of emotionally developed they are and how quickly they kind of learn to, or just enter into kind of talking about their emotions and supporting each other, and because a lot of them have never been in a all-male space before, and I actually think, like personally, that's one of my passions. I actually think that we need those single-sex spaces to be able to kind of really connect with each other, and I think there's a real kind of suspicion around male-only spaces at the moment in the culture, and actually that's really, really necessary.
I told you about the Camille Paglia video that's the most popular on our channel,
Yeah.
and I don't know if it's this one, but one point she made in that conversation was that in traditional agrarian societies there was the world of men and the world of women, and that's just completely disintegrated. It's actually one interesting difference between much of the Muslim world and the West, is that there's still like a deep separation between the sexes, and so you do have a lot of male-only spaces and a lot of female-only spaces in the Muslim world, but not in the West. So yeah, just adding to that.
And I think a lot of it is the difficulty of finding yourself in a world that is rapidly changing. So I think a lot of what we see, this is kind of delving into economic philosophy almost, is a relative deprivation and a capability deprivation even, where people are not able to change their circumstances. And that's what causes a lot of this radicalization. I've read a lot of research on it actually. For example, in Hong Kong, the protesters now, it's all relative deprivation and capability deprivation. When you can't achieve your aims within the status quo, that's when you turn to these other measures. So I'm not sure like the nature of the work that you've done in counseling, but I'm sure it has something to do with that individual freedom and right.
Yeah, well, it feels more relevant to the journalistic work in kind of around the world, because that was sort of one of the main fuels of the Arab Spring as well. Right. This sense of kind of inability to change anything, and also a big imbalance in numbers between, or opportunities between men and women as well. Sort of like that kind of marriage opportunities and stuff is a huge driver of a lot of the unrest. Yeah, and China as well, because there's such a imbalance now between men and women in China. Like numbers of women born compared to men, but like in some areas of China, it's a huge difference.
With regards to sort of like the IDW's appeal to people outside of America or even perhaps the West, I would say, because Jordan Peterson has fans across Africa and Asia and those. So what do you think there's sort of like a common thread? To what extent sort of like the cultural left pushback could be used as an excuse for sort of like his popularity in those spaces, or whether it's a masculinity question, or what questions do you think perhaps are most pertinent to those populations that are sort of allowing the popularity of these groups in those spaces, or is it just like a self-help type stuff?
Yeah, drawing on that point also with this pushback against the left, a lot of what the left focuses on, especially in like the European model, for example, is collectivism, this idea of a community, while people like Jordan Peterson, for example, advocate strongly for individual rights and freedoms and exercising individual agency. So it draws a lot of people in, which is why we see people like Jordan Peterson become so popular now, that to have someone telling you to exercise those individual rights, it's like a uniquely American experiment even in some ways.
But it's not so much individual rights as individual meaning, I'd say, is the thing that he... Responsibility and like with Jordan Peterson, I've always thought that he's necessary but not sufficient. That it's something that a lot of people have forgotten, and it's like the traditional values that we've kind of not been emphasizing or even kind of undermining. It's like, no, you need those. That's why I really like the Ken Wilber model that I showed before, because he says you need all of these systems. And if we've been in the sort of green, postmodern, do what you want, make yourself happy, whatever you want is right, don't rely on tradition, don't rely on anyone's beliefs. It's like, no, you're rejecting however many million years of evolution and however many thousand years of culture. Surely there's some wisdom there. And so for me, Jordan Peterson is like this massive injection of those traditional values that a generation now have kind of grown up without. And they're like, oh my God, there's actually something really valuable here. So it's a yes and. So Ken Wilber's kind of big phrase is yes and. It's like integration and moving beyond rather than rejection. And so many of it is kind of like, you see so many of the controversies in society, it's like traditional values versus modern values. And it's like, no, there's an integration and a potential kind of move beyond.
And I think that, that's the big question, where do we go from here, really?
Yeah, and the question about kind of where he's popular, I don't know how popular he is in somewhere like Russia, or I know that he's been very controversial in Scandinavia for kind of obvious reasons. Russia's such a different context. It's still a very kind of macho society. I don't really know where else he's kind of been successful and popular. I mean, I felt from the moment I saw him for the first time, I thought he's an archetypal figure, and he's bringing something the world desperately needs at the moment. And I still feel that. I feel like he's probably gone a little bit off track in terms of when he started touring his book. I think he just ended up sort of getting caught in the same thing night in, night out, and stopped kind of producing anything new and quite so meaningful. But I think he distills down the sort of mythopoetic underpinnings of Western and to some degree world culture as well as anyone that I've ever seen. Certainly anyone in the kind of YouTube age.
Sai, do you think part of the explanation could be that, again, social justice ideology, or whatever you want to call it, identity politics, the kind of way of thinking that is prevalent in the American academy, has actually captured the elite around much of the world, including Nigeria, and that Peterson resonates in part because people are not that enthused about the Nigerian elite who have imported a lot of these concepts.
I do take, that's sort of my personal writing and reading takes that heavy tilt, that there's an importation of elite, of sort of cultural elite who sort of embody sort of especially the heavy leftist tilt with regards to sort of academia and just literature and writing. And I think about it particularly with literature in Nigeria, for example. There's heavy incentive to write about issues that sort of like feminism or sexuality or any of these issues are sort of more popular within the like the current leftist tilt, because there is the heavy monetary incentive to write about those issues, and that monetary incentive then then becomes the norm for Nigerian writers, and for the Nigerian regular, or I'd say the Nigerian person who's not part of that elite. It seems like a sort of like there's a deliberate misrepresentation, sort of like hijacking of what is Nigerian, or what are Nigerian values, and I'd say like Peterson sort of represented that pushback for a lot of them. Is like, and you see these debates, and I say as sophisticated and as complex as they happen in the American space, they are happening across the world. And I say particularly in Nigeria, it's just sort of like.
But is he popular throughout Nigeria? Or is it the Christian area?
It's between actually a lot of Muslim young men in Nigeria actually love Peterson. But I'd say within the educated elite, predominantly studied abroad or studied in Nigeria, and sort of are in tune with the happenings of the world. So they're all frustrated by sort of this larger cancel culture. Like all of them watch Will Smith movies, all of them know who Kevin Hart is. So there's like, I think there's like the world space that has sort of been like, that exists by virtue, and the left-right dynamic is evident in this space. So that differentiation, somehow people still find Peterson in the mess of all that and still latch onto him because they are equally frustrated with it.
So you think it's more the social justice part pushback than it is the kind of religious or
I think
poetic message?
I think more the social justice pushback than it is anything else, because I think the religious undertones, sort of like the religious heaviness, is still predominant in countries like Nigeria. But I think something also that's really happened is, I think some people want to disagree with the social justice left, but want to find more complex disagreements and not simply come from a place of religious disagreement, because typically most of the disagreements with sort of like feminism in particular in Nigeria, which is like a very constant argument, is like, oh, it goes against our religion in XYZ ways. I think a lot of the more educated elite sort of latch on to Petersonian ideas in order to find a constructive critique of the left that's not rooted in religion.
One quick comment and then over to Dan. I just wanted to mention that it was occurring to me as we were talking about the importance of building on tradition and like building on a previous period, like the Orange modern period, rather than discarding it, Peterson, in his critique of postmodernism, one of the points he always goes back to is his concern with Derrida's concept of phallogocentrism. He's basically critiquing Derrida for challenging one of the very core ideas of the Enlightenment, namely the primacy of reason, right? I think he regards Derrida's critique of phallogocentrism as like a frontal assault on Orange, rather than like a postmodern building on Orange, right?
Yeah, and I wonder, do you know, have you read Derrida? Have you?
No.
Yeah, neither have I.
Like literally not a word.
Camille Paglia's take on that, which was that post-structuralism was required in French because of the nature of the French language, that it's a very crystallized language and it needs to be broken apart. She's like, that wasn't necessary in English.
Yeah, and she lampoons intellectuals in the English-speaking world for mimicking the kind of complicated constructions of the French language in English in a way that just sounds completely awkward. Like, just for example, I can't stand when people use problematic as a noun. You guys know what I'm talking? Have you guys ever heard? Yeah, and that's totally an import from French, and only in like anthro and sociology. And, do they? Yeah. At the heart of the problematic is. You never. Well, you should take more anthro class.
No, I don't think so. Actually, I would like that. I'm gonna start using that. Thank you. Not at night, though. I absolutely will.
You're going to get yourself a reputation as being a problem.
Away from the French for a moment. The last 15 minutes or maybe a little longer, I was gone for a bit. It seems like we've been talking about the need to return to some values of traditional masculinity and the excesses you said in Nigeria of sort of post-material values, I guess, or postmodern values, depending on who you ask. It seems like there's a pretty simple name for this type of discourse, which is it's cultural conservatism, and it seems, I might not like that, but it seems a hell of a... Well, okay, but... No, but... Okay, yeah, but some processes that have occurred over time have gone too far. And that seems like a hell of a lot more healthy than some of the current discourses in, both in the United States and the UK in terms of like the conservative movement and in terms of reckoning with sort of right-wing social policies all over the world. I mean, you see returns to like a more traditional masculine view in places like Russia and Hungary that end with, people being arrested and businesses shut down for the wrong political views. So it seems like it would be really quite useful if this part of the IDW were to be more assertive and more explicitly polarized as part of the conservative movement. So do you think you can find a home for that type of thing? Because certainly it's not popular on the left, but as someone on the left, I'd much rather have that type of discourse than Donald Trump ranting and raving or Viktor Orban putting his opponents in prison. So do you think you could, not you personally, but this type of discourse can find a home in a sort of productive way on the right?
I've heard various people in the IDW say that the healthiest part of the political spectrum right now is the centre-right. I don't know necessarily where I'd agree with them. I think the thing that came up while you were talking for me is that I feel like we've confused equality and equivalence. And that's been one of the fundamental mistakes of kind of the liberal worldview over the last 20 years or so, is confusing any kind of difference with inequality. It's like, can we have equality and difference at the same time? And that primarily in gender. I mean, the men's retreats that we run are called the new masculinity. So we're not looking to kind of recover old ideas of masculinity. We kind of go in and say, well, we know that the old ideas don't suit us, especially if they rely on not expressing your feelings and just kind of getting on with it and stuffing it down. And I actually don't think that the current generation are, I think they've moved beyond that anyway. But it is reclaiming some values, like values of brotherhood, values of sort of fierce accountability, holding each other accountable, holding ourselves accountable, that kind of thing. I think that at its best is a masculine value.
I agree with that, but it seems like and I'm not saying this is you personally, but the title of our lecture, this event, which you picked very nicely, is how the
Actually, David wasn't a big fan of that title.
Oh, okay. Well, in that
I'm
case,
happy with it for this, but I don't want it to be the title on the video.
Okay, but so if you disagree with the title, then perhaps you won't like this, but it talks about how the IDW fought polarization and failed, and it seems like fighting polarization is not really a winning fight right now. And so what you described is something that seems to me like it would be a really healthy thing for the right to have. So why, you've talked about Dave Rubin can't criticize Donald Trump because he gets mobbed on YouTube. And why I don't like Dave Rubin, and it seems like you don't like Dave Rubin particularly, not to put words in your mouth, he seems a lot more interested in civil discourse than, say, 99% of the Republican media sphere at the moment. So it seems to me that people who are sort of pretty crappy at being independents would be sort of exemplars of moral clarity as the watchdogs of a political side of the aisle. So I guess you sort of attempted to answer this, but why can't these ideas, which seem pretty clearly culturally conservative to an extent, find a home on the right? Is it just that people don't like to say they're on a side these days?
I feel personally a sense of recoil when they're framed as being on the right, because I don't actually believe that. I think what we've got at the moment is, let's take Brett and Heather as an example. They're firmly on the left. They're Bernie Sanders supporters, but they're also evolutionary biologists. And you have a strong portion of the left that's just rejecting outright evolutionary biology. They had a really interesting show on Joe Rogan where they said, look, most of the talk on the left about gender roles and about sexuality is completely alien to not only our history but all animals' history. There are certain things, we're not doomed by biology, we're not fated by biology. On the right, there's a sort of this is how it's always been, it's biologically fixed, therefore these are the gender roles that we have to embrace. On the left, it's kind of no, human nature is completely malleable. It's the blank slate idea that is being sort of attacked now quite kind of comprehensively. I think there's a middle way where we kind of recognize our biological inheritance, our cultural inheritance, recognize that there's some truth. There's some truth in marriage, that we've lost something by making divorce more accessible. For example, I don't think that should be seen as just a right-wing value, or that or a left-wing value. I think there should be a conversation that goes beyond being seen as either left or right and says, look, there are these realities. There are these realities of biology, there are these realities of culture, but they're not fate. There's another great phrase that Brett came up with, which is, we may not be blank slates, but we are the blankest slates around. Therefore, we do have, we're not doomed by that. That for me is an adult conversation, not saying this is conservatism, because I don't really believe that it is. Like that for me is a healthy conversation when we put all of that on the table, and then we're not kind of trying to give it labels of being left or right.
The intersectionality idea that you brought up earlier, whether or not that's the postmodern ideas had led to the Civil War, and I have a feeling that it's a little more... Civil rights.
Not
sorry,
Civil War.
sorry. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a bit
hell
of
a Freudian slip there.
I have a feeling it's a little bit more of the Enlightenment ideas, and that's what Ken Wilber says, that it wasn't the postmodern, that it was the Enlightenment ideas that led to that.
Well, also potentially Christian ideas. I mean, I wonder whether, I've not heard Jordan Peterson say this, but the tale that he already sketches out is that effectively what we're seeing with human rights being rolled out is more and more people being seen from the Christian perspective. You have an innate divinity and therefore rights, etc.
And that's what Peterson points out, but it's part of a much larger conversation that Brandon and I have had again and again. But I think what Peterson's doing that's part of a good thing that the IDWW is doing, where the left is sort of depersonalizing things as it gets the state larger and larger, which leads to people getting lost in personal responsibility and feeling as though they're victimized, or because that's a message that the left is definitely like putting forth, and that the state can take care of them, and where religion played a good role is that it personalized things like charity and helping people out and personal responsibility. And so that people like Ben Shapiro that bring that up, that as a value of Judeo-Christian charity and churches and synagogues, and the personalization of helping people out in a community and how that helps people and makes them more responsible, and how Jordan Peterson's message is also doing that kind of thing in a way that people who are more secular can also hold on to.
In the past few months, at least, I've become very skeptical of sort of like heavy critiques of very leftist ideas, and sort of like one thing I've sort of come to realize is in conception and in practice, very different things. In conception, most of these ideas like intersectionality tend to be very different from what happens in practice, and I see that a lot, and I'm always very skeptical of sort of like critiques of like intersectionality and things like that. Like if you look back to the days of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and like the two sisters and their sympathies with sort of like the abolitionists at the time, and sort of like those alliances, the words like intersectionality between feminists and sort of like abolitionists, it was an intersection of sort of like race and what do they call it, gender there, but there was no sort of like term like hermeneutically coagulated to call it intersectionality, but those intersections still existed. And I remember when they had the town hall, the black woman stood up to speak, and she sort of spoke about like how the black woman is being ignored in the midst of this madness because there's sort of like a deal struck. It said we would give you feminist rights, and I remember there was a whole debate about that. But I think that sort of conversation really boils down to how willing are we to sort of like grant the left, even in our critiques, some charity, and like think like by just demonizing the concept of intersectionality, which has existed and perhaps even an Enlightenment value, rather than sort of like this postmodern demonization of it that sort of has come around. There's a real sense to it. Like people demonize things like trigger warnings. Like it's simply just a heads up. The words have come out to be coagulated in very different ways, but like in reality it's like, yo, heads up, I'm about to show something that could be really damaging. Or like microaggressions really just turn out to be much more subtle things. And I think there's a cloud that even comes around by just sort of the critiquing of the left that I think we like needs to be drawn off, and like just really looking at things like intersectionality is not necessarily this postmodern idea. They've existed as part of what we considered and celebrated in the Enlightenment values and sort of like as modern things. Like to ask the question as to whether the resulting production of like a more equal society in race and gender, as whether it's a postmodern question or as a modern question, I think is a very big question. Do we want to say, oh, because black people got the rights to vote and gay people were able to get married at these times, like are those suddenly like postmodern ideas? Doesn't that go against the entire value of the modern project, which is sort of meant to be this self-correcting mechanism that allows for dissent and continuous self-correction? So I think there's a delineation there that has not happened, or at least I'm not privy to, that between what may be considered to be modern and postmodern. And I think people like were wound to draw anything that sort of comes to the leftist cancel culture type social justice extreme left thing, that it seems distasteful as that, and then anything that seems, well, in some sense, what they call it, granting of civil rights, then just sort of push that under sort of like the modern umbrella without sort of this nice, and I think it's hard to delineate because in some sense they sort of come together in one package. Like it's hard to draw a distinction about the postmodern, because while we do draw it like with the writings of the Foucault and the Derrida, like it isn't really as crisp as that. Like there's still sort of this, like, would we call the period we're in a postmodern, or are we simply experiencing postmodern threads within still a modernizing period? And I think there's this sleight of hand that continues to happen in whenever we talk about like sort of the left or like sort of the far, air quotes, social justice left, and really just put them in like the bracket with anything distasteful, while refusing to recognize that the ideas that they produce are sort of like central to what the values of, well, if we consider a modern, self-correcting, like liberal enterprise.
You want to add anything to that, or we've got just 3 or 4 minutes, so you're putting up Peterson numbers.
Putting up Peterson numbers.
In that he came and stayed for about this long.
Oh, good. Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get just as many views online. No, I mean, I think it would be really worth. I can send out the link to the ebook that Ken Wilber wrote, because he pulls apart the kind of modern thing quite a lot. I mean, I've always been sort of fascinated by that frame. Is it the rolling out of universal values? Was that a modernist project? And the kind of idea with intersectionality, I do differentiate it in some way, because I think for me intersectionality is when it becomes an ideology, but that's kind of about terms more than anything. Like for me, that's when you have an ideology that basically says this is the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is based around these particular intersections of fixed points. And I just think it's so anti-human, because if more, just the fact that more white men are killing themselves than just about anyone else in this supposed pyramid already says, well, there's something that it's not taking into account. There's something that's not being, if more people are willing to end their own lives and they're supposed to be near the top of this pyramid, then there's something that's just really off about using that as the only way of looking at the world. And that's what I'd say is kind of intersectionality, when it's the only frame that people are looking through the world, and the only frame that decides who's going to speak and decides what's going to orient social policy and all the rest of it. It's like, well, there's clearly factors that are not being included, and I think the individual in particular is just lost. Like the individual story and the individuals, it just feels to me like completely anti-human to decide what you think about someone before you've even met them, and you've got all of these assumptions about how their life must have been. And like a white man who had a mother who was kind of, I don't know, an addict or just completely unable to cope with children, like that destroys people. Intersectionality, for me, it's the word used when that thing becomes a really fixed ideology, but then different people use it in different ways.
I agree with that. I mean, my issue with a lot of the social justice left is that they really dehumanize a lot of individuals by just completely refusing to, making fun of them, you know? If they too claim that they're going through a difficult time but don't belong to the right category of people, I mean, it's just like...
There was a horrific example of this kind of ideology. David Cameron, the previous Prime Minister of the UK, there was a review of he just brought out his recent book, and the review in The Guardian said it had a line in it, something about, so his son Ivan was born with cerebral palsy or some bad wasting disease, and then died age 6. So he was really in need of like serious care and then died at age 6. And this line, this review of his book had something in it like he experienced some tragedy of his son, but nothing compared to if he hadn't had the privilege to shield him. It's just like, okay, that's just a horrific thing to say about another human being. Like to comment on, yeah, well, his son died after a horrible wasting disease, but didn't really affect him because he had a lot of money. Like that's just insane. But that's where this kind of ideological perspective goes if you just see power and privilege as being the only kind of differentiating factor, rather than like human feelings of a father for his son. For example, that's one example.